My name is Rebecca, and I am 33 years old. I never anticipated that sending a simple text would detonate the facade of our family dynamic, but their absolute cruelty was the final push I needed to stop playing the victim. On the night of my birthday, I sat alone in my apartment staring at a phone screen that held a message from my own mother. She told me the family was better off without me and demanded that I never contact them again. My younger sister immediately liked the message. They thought they were simply cutting off a daughter they deemed too negative. What they completely forgot was that they were also cutting off the sole trustee of the multimillion-dollar family fortune they had been draining for a decade. I gave them exactly the space they requested, along with a complete financial freeze. Less than 12 hours later, my phone was blowing up with 86 missed calls, and someone was trying to break down my front door. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who took your generosity for granted. The rain was hitting the glass of my living room windows in heavy sheets. I sat on my sofa holding a lukewarm mug of tea, listening to the hum of the city traffic down below. I stared at the walls, wondering how it was possible to feel so entirely isolated in a city of millions of people. It was my 33rd birthday. There were no balloons, no cake, no chorus of voices singing to me in a crowded restaurant. My apartment was impeccably clean and decorated in neutral tones. As a wealth management compliance officer, my professional life was dedicated to order rules and ensuring that numbers aligned perfectly. But my personal life specifically, my relationship with my family, was a mess of unbalanced ledgers and unpaid emotional debts. I had spent the entire day at my downtown office reviewing audit reports and flagging irregular offshore transfers for corporate clients. Not a single person from my family had called. Not my mother Susan, my father Richard, or my sister Courtney. I had checked my phone obsessively between meetings, rationalizing their silence. They were busy. They had forgotten the date. They were planning a surprise. By 8 o'clock that evening, the reality had settled in cold and undeniable. They had simply chosen not to reach out. Still, the ingrained habit of trying to please them, of trying to be the dutiful daughter who kept the peace, pushed me to make the first move. I picked up my phone and opened our family group chat. The last message was from 3 days ago, a photo of Courtney posing on a country club tennis court. I typed out a polite message. "Hey everyone. Just finishing up some work at the apartment. Since it is my birthday today, I was wondering if anyone might be free to grab a quick dinner, or even just a drink somewhere close by. My treat." I hit send. I stared at the 3 pulsing dots indicating someone was typing. My heart did a familiar, pathetic little flutter of hope. Maybe they would apologize for forgetting. Maybe they would suggest a nice Italian place downtown. The pulsing dots vanished. Then they returned. Then they stopped altogether. 2 full minutes passed in agonizing silence. I took a sip of my tea, telling myself not to overthink it. Finally, my phone vibrated, buzzing violently against the glass coffee table. I picked it up, my eyes scanning the screen. The message was from my mother, Susan. It did not contain an apology. It read, "We are better off without you. We need space from your constant negativity. Do not contact us again." I stopped breathing briefly. I read the words again, my brain refusing to process the sheer cruelty of the text. Constant negativity. That was her code word for my occasional requests for basic respect, or my mild suggestions that they perhaps stick to a budget. Before I could even formulate a thought, a second notification popped up on the screen. It was an alert from the group chat. Courtney had interacted with the message. A small red heart appeared right next to my mother's brutal text. Courtney loved the message. She loved the idea of cutting me out of their lives completely. A wave of profound humiliation washed over me, hot and stinging. They had not just forgotten my birthday. They had used it as an opportunity to discard me. I sat there in the silence of my apartment waiting for the tears to come. I waited for the crushing weight of inadequacy that usually followed their rejections. I waited to feel like the boring, unlovable scapegoat they had always painted me to be. But the tears never came. Instead, a deep, icy calm settled into my chest, the kind of absolute clarity that only arrives when a glass shatters so completely that it can never be put back together. I slowly placed my tea mug on a coaster. I did not text back a desperate plea for an explanation. I did not call my mother to beg for forgiveness for whatever imaginary slight I had committed. I stood up, walked into my home office, and opened the bottom drawer of my heavy oak desk. I pulled out a small encrypted banking token. The device was sleek black and completely unassuming, yet it controlled everything. 10 years ago, my grandfather, a shrewd and fiercely practical man, had bypassed his own son and his golden child granddaughter when he set up the family trust. He had looked at my father, Richard, a man who had already driven 2 businesses into the ground, and my mother, Susan, a woman who treated money like a limitless natural resource, and he had made a calculated decision. He appointed me the quiet, analytical compliance officer as the sole legally mandated trustee of his massive estate. For a decade, I had honored his wishes. I had managed the investments, filed the compliance reports, and swallowed my pride while signing off on the monthly beneficiary distributions that funded my family lavish lifestyle. I had watched them buy luxury cars, book first-class tickets to Europe, and throw ridiculous parties, all while treating me like an administrative assistant. They viewed the trust fund as their personal piggy bank, and they viewed me as the annoying obstacle standing between them and their cash. They hated that I asked for receipts. They resented that I required proper tax documentation, and now they had decided they were better off without my constant negativity. I carried the token back to the living room and booted up my secure laptop. The blue light from the screen illuminated the dark room as I logged into the master portal of the trust accounts. The dashboard displayed the sprawling web of family finances. Susan and Richard primary checking account, Courtney Platinum credit lines, the automatic transfers covering the mortgage on their estate. They had relied on my dutiful nature for so long that they genuinely believed the money flowed by magic. They completely forgot that my signature authorized every single dime they spent. "You want space," I murmured to the empty room, my voice steady and devoid of any remaining affection. "You have got it." I navigated to the central beneficiary control panel. A list of active disbursement accounts appeared on the screen, each one tied to the family members who had just discarded me. My finger hovered over the trackpad. By law, as the trustee, I had the fiduciary right, and indeed the obligation, to suspend distributions if the beneficiaries demonstrated hostile, uncooperative, or legally complicated behavior. A text message demanding no contact and effectively severing family ties easily met the criteria for a hostile environment. I checked the box next to Susan and Richard primary distribution line. I checked the box next to Courtney supplemental allowance. I scrolled down to the bottom of the page, bypassing all the secondary accounts, and found the master override button. It read, "Suspend all beneficiary distributions." I did not hesitate. I clicked the button. A red warning prompt appeared asking me to confirm the global freeze. I clicked confirm. The screen refreshed, and bright red status indicators populated across every single family account. The financial pipeline was officially severed. I closed the laptop, walked into my bedroom, and went to sleep, feeling lighter than I had in 33 years. At 6 o'clock the next morning, my phone screen illuminated the dark bedroom, vibrating violently against the nightstand. It showed 86 missed calls from my mother, my father, and my sister. Before I could even reach for the device, heavy, desperate fists began pounding on my apartment door, shaking the frame on its hinges. The pounding on my apartment door was so violent, the peephole cover rattled against the wood. I did not rush. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, taking a slow sip as the frantic knocking continued. Only when I was completely ready did I unlock the deadbolt and pull the heavy oak door open. Susan, Richard, and Courtney stormed into my entryway like a hurricane of designer fabrics and misplaced outrage. My mother was clutching her cell phone as if it had personally offended her. My father looked red in the face, a vein throbbing at his temple. But it was my sister Courtney who was the most spectacular sight. She was wearing a silk bathrobe, her hair completely unstyled, tears streaming down her face and ruining her expensive eyelash extensions. "Fix it right now," Susan demanded, bypassing any form of greeting. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. "I do not care what sort of computer glitch you caused at the bank. You need to call them and fix it before Courtney's entire engagement is ruined." I took another sip of my coffee, leaning against the hallway wall. "Good morning to you too. I am doing well, thanks for asking. How is your morning going?" "Do not play smart with me," Richard snapped, stepping forward to physically loom over me. "Courtney was at the marina an hour ago. She tried to swipe her black card for the $40,000 non-refundable deposit on the luxury yacht rental for her engagement party. The card was declined. The yacht broker laughed in her face, Rebecca. Laughed. She was humiliated in front of the marina staff. It was mortifying," Courtney sobbed, collapsing onto my entryway bench. "They told me my card was flagged for frozen assets." The bridal coordinator from the agency was right next to me. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing that is? You are supposed to handle this. You are supposed to make sure the accounts are topped off." I looked at my sister, watching her cry over a boat rental on the morning after she celebrated my mother telling me to cut contact. "That sounds like a very stressful morning for you, Courtney. But the bank did not make an error." "Then what is the problem?" Susan shrieked, throwing her hands in the air. "Did you forget to transfer the monthly allowance from your grandfather's estate again? You have one job in this family. One job. We do not ask you to attend social functions because you always bring the mood down. We do not ask you to help with the wedding planning because you lack any sense of style. All we ask is that you sit at your little desk, crunch your little numbers, and make sure the trust functions so your sister can shine." Richard nodded in agreement, crossing his arms over his chest. "Exactly. Your grandfather left you in charge of the paperwork because that is all you are good at. You are a compliance officer. You are a human calculator. Courtney is the face of this family. She is marrying into high society next month. We cannot afford to look like we are struggling because you failed to click a button on a banking portal." The sheer audacity of his statement hung in the air. He was casually admitting that my entire existence was merely a financial utility to them. They did not see me as a daughter or a sister. I was the administrative staff required to keep their extravagant lifestyle afloat. In the past, words like that would have sent me spiraling into a deep depression. I would have spent days trying to figure out how to earn their love, how to prove that I was more than just a signature on a check. But today, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, hard sense of vindication. I pushed off the wall and walked past them into the living room, setting my coffee mug down on the glass table. They followed me like angry ducklings, clearly frustrated that I was not scrambling to fix their crisis. "I did not forget to make a transfer," I said calmly, turning to face them. "And there is no computer glitch." I froze the accounts. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the faint hum of my refrigerator in the kitchen. Courtney stopped crying, her mouth falling open. "You did what?" I froze the accounts, I repeated, enunciating each word clearly. "All of them. You're checking your savings, the joint family lines of credit, and the automatic disbursement channels from the main trust. Every single financial avenue tied to my authorization as the trustee is currently suspended." Susan stepped forward, her face twisting into a mask of pure fury. "Have you lost your mind? Unfreeze them immediately. Who do you think you are to play games with our money?" "It is not your money," I reminded her. "It is grandfather's money. The money he placed in a legally binding trust. The trust that I control." "You control it for us," Richard yelled, taking another step toward me. "You are just the manager. Now stop throwing a temper tantrum over whatever imaginary slight you think we committed and turn the cards back on. If we lose that yacht, Courtney will be the laughingstock of the yacht club." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I unlocked the screen and opened the family group chat from last night. I held the screen up so they could all see it clearly. "This is from 8 o'clock last night," I said, my voice steady and professional. "I asked if anyone wanted to get dinner for my birthday. Mom, your exact response was, 'We are better off without you. We need space from your constant negativity. Do not contact us again.'" Courtney, you immediately loved the message. Dad, you read it and said nothing. So what? Susan scoffed, rolling her eyes. You are being overly sensitive. You know how stressful wedding planning is for us right now. You are always complaining about budgets and spending. I was just setting a boundary for my own mental peace. It was just a text message. It was a written directive from the primary beneficiaries of a legal trust. I corrected her, adopting the exact tone I used during federal compliance audits at work. As the sole trustee, I have a legally mandated fiduciary duty to protect the assets and ensure they are distributed in a healthy cooperative environment. When the beneficiaries explicitly state that the trustee brings constant negativity and demand no contact, it legally constitutes a hostile environment. Courtney stared at me blankly. What does that even mean? It means, I said, looking directly at my sister, that I cannot legally or ethically distribute funds to parties who refuse to communicate with the trustee. You requested space. You demanded no contact. By law, I am honoring your request. Suspending the financial distributions is standard compliance protocol when a hostile conflict arises between a trustee and the beneficiaries. I am just doing my job. Richard's face went from red to a dangerous shade of purple. This is not a corporate boardroom, Rebecca. This is your family. You cannot use legal loopholes to punish us because your feelings got hurt. You were the one who just reminded me that I am merely a compliance officer, I said, taking my seat on the sofa and crossing my legs. I am simply acting in my professional capacity. If you want no contact, you get no contact. But no contact means no money. Susan began to panic. The reality of the situation was finally piercing through her armor of entitlement. Her eyes darted around my apartment as if looking for a hidden camera or a way out of this trap. Rebecca, listen to me, Susan said, her voice trembling slightly as she tried to force a placating tone. We did not mean it like that. We were just tired. We love you. You are part of this family. Now please stop this nonsense. The yacht broker is holding the reservation for 2 more hours. Just call the bank and authorize the charge. No. The single syllable dropped like a stone. Courtney let out a sharp wail, burying her face in her hands. You are ruining my life. Preston's family is going to think we are poor. They are going to cancel the wedding. Then you better find a cheaper boat, I suggested mildly. Richard had heard enough. His entire demeanor shifted from demanding to downright vicious. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his phone, holding it up like a weapon. The veins in his neck were bulging. He was a man used to bullying his way out of problems, a man who refused to be told no by a daughter he considered beneath him. Fine, Richard sneered, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. You want to play the legal game. We will play the legal game. I am calling the family lawyers right now. He began dialing a number, his eyes locked onto mine with a look of absolute hatred. I will have them file an emergency injunction by noon, Richard promised, stepping closer to me. I will tell a judge that you have suffered a complete mental breakdown. I will testify that you are emotionally unstable, vindictive, and entirely mentally unfit to manage a multi-million-dollar estate. I am your father, and my word carries weight. They will strip you of your trustee status before the banks close today. I will take over the trust myself. He pressed the phone to his ear, a cruel, victorious smile spreading across his face. And once I have legal control, Richard continued, I am cutting you out entirely. You will not see a single dime of your grandfather's money. Pack your bags, Rebecca. You are done in this family. I sat perfectly still on the sofa, watching my father prepare to destroy my reputation and my life over a yacht rental. I did not flinch. I did not beg him to hang up the phone. I just watched him, waiting for the perfect moment to show him the one thing he had entirely overlooked. The air in the room was thick with tension. Susan was watching Richard with a look of hopeful anticipation, believing that her husband was about to slay the dragon and restore their access to endless luxury. Courtney had stopped crying, sniffing quietly as she waited for her father to fix the problem she had created. They were all so confident in their ability to crush me. They had spent decades conditioning me to fold under this exact type of pressure. They expected me to break into tears, to apologize, to log back into the banking portal, and give them everything they wanted just to avoid their wrath. But I was not the same woman I was yesterday. The woman who craved their approval had died the moment I read that group chat message. The woman sitting on the sofa was a forensic compliance auditor who knew the law, knew the trust documents, and knew exactly how deeply they had dug their own graves. "Are you listening to me?" Richard barked, pulling the phone away from his ear for a second. "I said pack your bags. You are going to be penniless and homeless by tonight." I picked up my coffee mug, taking my time to savor the warm, bitter taste. I looked at the three people standing in my living room, the people who shared my blood but had never shared my heart. "Go ahead and call them Dad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper yet, carrying across the silent room. "Call the lawyers, call the judge, tell them whatever you want." Richard's smile faltered slightly. He had expected panic. He had expected submission. My absolute lack of fear was deeply unsettling to him. I leaned back against the cushions, locking eyes with my father. "But before you make that call, you might want to consider what happens when those lawyers actually read the trust documents. Specifically, the documents you never bothered to read." "What are you talking about?" Susan asked, her voice sharp with sudden anxiety. "Make the call, Dad," I repeated softly. "Let us see who ends up homeless." Richard's hand hovered over his phone screen. His thumb trembled slightly over the call button, but my absolute lack of panic made him freeze. Bullies always hesitate when their chosen victim stops cowering and stares back with dead eyes. He looked over at Susan, then down at Courtney before his furious gaze snapped back to me. He was waiting for me to break the silence, to offer a panicked compromise, to do what I had done my entire life and surrender unconditionally. I did not. Instead, I stood up from the sofa and walked over to the heavy oak bookshelf that lined the far wall of my living room. The rain continued to lash against the window panes, casting long shadows across the floor. I reached onto the highest shelf and pulled down a thick leather-bound binder. It was heavy, smelling of old paper, embossed with gold lettering that spelled out the Theodore Sterling Family Trust. I carried it back to the coffee table, letting it drop onto the glass surface with a resounding thud that echoed in the quiet room. The sudden noise made Courtney flinch, her tear-streaked face snapping upward. I sat back down, smoothed my skirt, and looked up at my father. "Go ahead and call Bennett and Associates, Dad," I offered smoothly. "But before you demand an emergency injunction to have me declared mentally unfit, I highly suggest you refresh your memory on page 42. I opened the heavy cover and began flipping through the thick cream-colored pages. The parchment rustled loudly. Richard stared at the binder as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. He had never bothered to read the actual trust documents. None of them had. They simply saw a pile of boring legal jargon that stood between them and their endless shopping sprees. They had assumed my grandfather just signed his wealth over to them and arbitrarily put my name at the top as an administrative formality. I found the page I was looking for. I rotated the heavy binder 180 degrees and slid it slowly across the glass table until it stopped right in front of Richard. "Read it," I instructed coldly. "Section 4, paragraph 2, the Morals and Conduct Clause." Richard scoffed, crossing his arms tighter against his chest. "I am not reading that legal garbage. You are making things up to save your skin. You have no authority to freeze our accounts permanently." "I do not have the authority to freeze them permanently," I agreed, tapping the thick page with my index finger. "But I do have the authority to freeze them for 6 months. And if you make that phone call to your lawyer, the freeze becomes mandatory." Susan stepped forward, quickly leaning over Richard's shoulder to look at the document. Her eyes scanned the dense legal text, her lips moving slightly as she tried to comprehend the complex words. "What does it say?" she demanded, looking at her husband with growing apprehension. Richard finally dropped his phone to his side and leaned over the table. As he read the paragraph silently, the arrogant, victorious smirk slowly melted off his face, replaced by a sickly pale realization of his own powerlessness. "Grandfather Theodore was many things, but he was certainly not a fool," I said, leaning back into the sofa cushions. "He loved you, Dad, but he also knew exactly who and what you were. He watched you bankrupt 2 separate commercial real estate companies before you even turned 40 years old. He watched you squander millions of dollars on terrible high-risk investments because you always wanted the quick payout without doing the actual work. He knew that if he simply handed you the keys to the kingdom, the entire family fortune would be gone within 5 short years. That is exactly why he made me the sole trustee. He knew I respected the numbers. He knew I respected his legacy. Richard opened his mouth to argue, to loudly defend his catastrophic business failures, but I cut him off immediately. Grandfather also knew exactly how you operate. I continued, my voice calm, clinical, and detached. He knew that the very first moment I tried to tell you no, you would try to bully me into submission. He knew you would threaten me, harass me, or try to drag me into a courtroom to strip me of my authority. That is precisely why he had his top attorneys draft the morals and conduct clause. It was his ultimate fail-safe to protect the trust assets from your inevitable temper tantrums. I pointed at the open page again. Let me summarize it for you, since reading legal text is clearly not your strong suit. The clause explicitly states that any attempt by the beneficiaries to harass, intimidate, sue, or extort the acting trustee will result in an immediate mandatory 6-month freeze of all trust assets. The moment you file an injunction claiming I am mentally unfit, the law firm is required by the strict parameters of the trust to lock down every single account for half a year, no exceptions, no appeals, no emergency allowances. If you make that call right now, Dad, you are not taking control of the trust. You are legally locking yourself out of it until the end of the year. The silence in my apartment returned, but this time it was utterly suffocating. The grim reality of their situation was finally penetrating their lifelong delusion of untouchable wealth. If they fought me, they lost everything. If they threatened me, they lost everything. I held absolutely all the cards, and for the first time in my entire life, I was not afraid to play them. Courtney was the very first one to break under the pressure. She let out a sound that was half gasp, half shriek. 6 months, she wailed loudly, throwing her hands in the air. 6 months. My wedding is in exactly 2 months. Preston wealthy family has already booked their first-class flights from London. We have massive deposits due today for the floral arrangements, the celebrity caterer, and the string quartet. If we do not pay the yacht broker by noon today, we lose the reservation and the non-refundable deposit completely. She spun around to face Susan, her face contorted in pure, unadulterated panic. Mom, do something right now. You told me to ignore her text last night. You explicitly said we did not need to coddle her anymore. Tell her to fix it. My life is completely ruined. My entire wedding is ruined because you wanted to prove a point to her. Susan's eyes darted wildly between Courtney's crying face and the thick leather binder resting on the table. The polished facade of the confident, wealthy matriarch was crumbling fast, revealing the terrified woman beneath. She looked at me, her features twisting into an ugly mask of desperation and unhinged rage. You are an absolute monster, Susan spat, taking an aggressive step toward me. Her voice was shaking with intense fury. You are a cold, vindictive, heartless monster. Are you happy now, Rebecca? Are you satisfied with yourself? You are ruining your own sister's happiness, her one incredibly special day, over a little joke in a group chat. It was just a joke. We were just teasing you about being negative all the time, and you decide to illegally bankrupt your own family. How can you sit there so calmly and do this to your own flesh and blood? A joke, I repeated, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. Telling your daughter that you are better off without her, and aggressively demanding she never speak to you again on the night of her birthday is not a joke, Mom. It is a formal declaration of estrangement, and I am simply honoring your explicit wishes. You wanted space from me. The frozen bank accounts are now giving you plenty of space. Courtney dropped to her knees on my expensive living room rug, sobbing loudly into her hands, wailing hysterically about how Preston would immediately leave her if he found out her family actually had no money. Richard was staring blankly at the wall, completely paralyzed by the horrifying realization that his ultimate legal threat had been neutralized by a dead man, incredible foresight. Susan was hyperventilating now, pacing frantically back and forth across my floor. Her hands were pulling at her hair, her designer rings flashing brightly in the morning light. She was muttering to herself, stringing together frantic, panicked sentences as her mind raced through the severe consequences of a 6-month financial drought. "It is not just the wedding," Susan gasped, her pacing becoming more erratic and desperate. "The exclusive country club dues are scheduled for tomorrow. The landscaping staff needs to be paid on Friday. Richard, do something now." She grabbed my father's arm and shook him violently. "Richard, if the accounts are frozen for 6 months, we cannot make the transfers. If we miss the payment to the private lender, they get the house. Unfreeze it now, Rebecca. Unfreeze it." The room suddenly seemed to drop 10 degrees. My coffee mug stopped halfway to my mouth. The sobbing from Courtney faded into distant white noise. The sound of the heavy rain against the window vanished entirely. My entire body went rigid. I slowly lowered my mug back to the table, my eyes locking onto my mother's pale, terrified face. My mind, professionally trained to detect financial anomalies and trace hidden assets, seized immediately upon the words she had just shrieked in her blind panic. "If we miss the payment to the private lender, they get the house." I stared silently at my parents. The massive family estate in the hills, the sprawling property with the manicured lawns and the 6-car garage was fully paid off. Grandfather Theodore had bought it in cash 30 years ago. I knew the trust ledgers inside and out. The estate was absolutely not mortgaged to a traditional bank. There was absolutely no logical reason for them to be making desperate payments to a private lender, unless my father had done something highly illegal. The silence in my apartment after they scrambled out the door was absolute. I did not chase them down the hallway. I did not call out after them. I simply engaged the deadbolt, walked into my kitchen, and poured the remainder of my cold coffee down the sink. By noon, my phone began vibrating continuously on my kitchen counter. It was not Richard calling with his team of aggressive lawyers. It was an orchestrated, highly calculated social media assault. I unlocked my screen to find 72 new text messages from extended family members, people I had not spoken to in several years. The messages were vitriolic and deeply personal. My Aunt Patricia sent a lengthy paragraph calling me a bitter, jealous spinster who was determined to ruin everyone else's happiness because I could not find a man of my own. My cousin David sent a voice note telling me I was a disgrace to our grandfather memory and a stain on the family name. Confused by the sudden onslaught, I opened my social media app. Right at the top of my feed was a video my mother had posted just an hour earlier. Susan was sitting in her lavish, sunlit living room, intentionally wearing no makeup to look appropriately distressed. She was sobbing directly to the camera, clutching a tissue to her chest with a trembling hand. She told her thousands of followers that I had suffered a severe mental breakdown and had illegally hijacked the family trust funds. She painted a heartbreaking, entirely fictitious picture of a jealous older sister so consumed by bitterness over being single that I was willing to destroy my younger sister. Beautiful wedding. Courtney sat right next to her on the designer sofa, looking utterly devastated, silently wiping away tears for the camera. Susan begged for prayers and asked their wealthy social circle for patience as they dealt with my tragic mental instability. The video already had hundreds of sympathetic comments from their country club friends. They were building a false narrative. They were intentionally isolating me, turning the entire extended family and their high society friends against me before I could even attempt to explain my side of the story. They expected me to publicly defend myself. They wanted a messy, emotional online war to prove their point that I was unstable. I turned my phone on silent and tossed it into my leather purse. I did not care about their public relations campaign. I cared about the numbers. I cared about the massive, glaring slip of the tongue Susan had made in my living room while she was hyperventilating about the 6-month financial freeze. A private lender. My grandfather had purchased the sprawling family estate entirely in cash 3 decades ago. The property was securely held within the strict parameters of the trust. It was completely free and clear of any mortgages or financial obligations. There was absolutely no logical legal reason for my parents to be making desperate monthly payments to a private lender to keep the house. I grabbed my car keys and drove straight to my office downtown, ignoring the heavy rain pounding against my windshield. The weekend security guard waved me into the underground parking garage, completely used to my odd weekend hours. I rode the empty elevator up to the 30th floor and unlocked the heavy glass doors of my wealth management firm. The corporate office was dark and quiet, a sanctuary of logic and order. I walked straight to my desk, booted up my triple-monitor workstation, and logged into our advanced forensic compliance software. This was my absolute domain. Out in the real world, my family could manipulate gullible people with fake tears and designer clothes. But in this digital landscape of public records, wire transfers, and financial trails, numbers do not lie, and tears hold absolutely zero currency. I bypassed the standard trust ledgers they usually had me manage. If Richard had done something highly illegal, he certainly would not have run the transactions through the primary operating accounts that I rigorously audited every single month. I tapped directly into the county property tax database. I pulled up the unique parcel number for my parents' estate. I cross-referenced the property address with active commercial and private liens. I expected to find a hidden home equity line of credit, maybe a small personal loan they had somehow managed to take out to cover Courtney's extravagant lifestyle choices. What I found made my blood run completely cold. Sitting right there on the illuminated screen officially registered just 8 months ago was a massive $2 million lien against the family home. It was not held by a reputable national bank or a standard mortgage company. It was held by a shadowy entity called Apex Holdings. I immediately ran a comprehensive corporate background check on Apex Holdings using our firm's secure database. It was a shell corporation registered in Delaware with no physical office address and a registered agent that pointed back to a generic mail forwarding service. They were a hard money lender, the kind of predatory, unregulated financial institution that specifically caters to desperate people who cannot get approved for traditional bank loans. They charged exorbitant, borderline illegal interest rates and specialized in rapid, merciless foreclosures the very minute a scheduled payment was missed. Susan's frantic, terrified panic suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. If the trust accounts were frozen for 6 months under the Morals and Conduct Clause, they could not make the massive monthly payments on a $2 million hard money loan. Apex Holdings would legally seize the estate before the freeze was even lifted. But none of this answered the most critical, glaring legal question. The property was legally owned by the trust. Richard and Susan were merely beneficiaries who had the conditional right to reside there. They did not hold the actual deed. They possessed absolutely no legal authority to borrow money against the property. No legitimate title company or lender, even a shady hard money lender like Apex Holdings, would ever approve a $2 million lien against an estate without the explicit notarized signature of the legally appointed trustee. They would need my signature. They would need me to sit in a room with a licensed notary, provide federal identification, and sign away the equity of my grandfather meticulously built estate. I had never done that. I had never even heard the name Apex Holdings until exactly 5 minutes ago. My fingers flew across the keyboard, the clicking keys echoing in the empty office. My breathing slowed, my forensic auditing instincts taking complete control over my physical body. I navigated away from the general summary page and securely accessed the county clerk digital document repository. I formally requested the original scanned file of the deed of trust that secured the Apex Holdings loan. The loading wheel spun on the screen for a few agonizing seconds. I stared intently at the monitor, waiting for the legal document that would explain exactly how my father had managed to bypass the strict legal protections my grandfather had deliberately put in place to stop this exact scenario. The high-resolution PDF file finally rendered on my center monitor. I zoomed in on the document, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted paragraphs detailing the disbursement of the $2 million. I scrolled rapidly past the standard loan terms, past the predatory interest rates, and past the brutal foreclosure clauses that my father had recklessly agreed to. I scrolled straight to the final page of the document, the signature page. I stared at the bright white screen, my eyes tracing the dark black ink on the digital document. My heart hammered a steady rhythmic beat against my ribs. The realization of what this piece of paper represented crashed over me in a terrifying wave. This was not just a minor financial indiscretion. This was massive, undeniable bank fraud. This was a severe federal crime that carried mandatory prison sentences. Right there on the primary authorization line, directly above the printed title of sole trustee, was my name. It was not a sloppy forgery. It was not a hasty, messy scribble done by someone simply trying to guess my handwriting in a rush. It was an absolutely flawless, perfectly executed forgery of my own signature. I stared at the looping, elegant cursive on the screen. It was my signature down to the exact slight leftward tilt of the capital R and the sharp, aggressive cross of the lowercase t. But I had absolutely never held the pen that dragged that dark ink across this physical page. My heart hammered a frantic, heavy beat against my ribs, but the initial wave of shock quickly hardened into a cold, methodical focus. A financial forgery of this immense magnitude was not a spur-of-the-moment decision made in a panic. It required deliberate planning, inside access, and willing accomplices. I zoomed in on the notary public stamp pressed firmly directly below my forged name. The circular blue seal was slightly faded from the scanning process, but the text was perfectly legible. The notary was listed as Gregory Vance, a licensed professional operating within the state. I opened a new secure tab on my dual-monitor terminal and directly accessed the State Bar and Notary Public Registry. I typed the name Gregory Vance into the search bar. The database spit out his official credentials and employment history instantly. He was currently listed as a junior associate at a highly prestigious corporate law firm located right here in the downtown district. The firm was Sterling Vance and Hughes. The name of that specific firm hit me like a physical blow to the chest. That was the exact same law firm where Preston, my sister Courtney, incredibly wealthy and socially prominent fiancé, was currently working as a senior associate. The puzzle pieces slammed together with terrifying, undeniable clarity. Richard had not just scammed a hard money lender to secure a bag of cash. He had actively enlisted my future brother-in-law to help facilitate the massive fraud. Preston had clearly used a junior associate stamp either with or without the junior lawyer knowledge to falsely notarize a completely forged document, illegally binding our family estate to a predatory loan. They were all in on it. But why? My father was a notoriously terrible businessman with a long history of failed ventures. But $2 million was a massive sum to borrow from a shadow lender at a punishing 20% interest rate. Where did all that cash actually go? I pulled up our proprietary forensic tracking software, a highly sophisticated tool, usually reserved for hunting offshore tax evaders and corporate embezzlers. I punched the specific routing numbers from the Apex Holdings loan disbursement document directly into the search field. The digital trail lit up my screen instantly. The money had absolutely not gone to property taxes. It had not gone to structural repairs for the family estate. It had not been invested in any traditional yield-bearing accounts. Instead, the entire $2 million had been wired directly into a commercial holding account registered to Aura and Ice LLC. Aura and Ice was Courtney Vanity Project. It was a luxury lifestyle brand she had launched 2 years ago, selling overpriced organic linen napkins, imported sea salt, and absurdly expensive scented candles. She constantly bragged on her social media platforms about being a self-made female founder. She aggressively claimed her business was booming routinely, posting highly staged photos of a busy shipping warehouse and allegedly exclusive pop-up shops in Paris and Milan. Preston family, old money aristocrats, who severely looked down on inherited wealth without personal ambition, absolutely loved that Courtney was a fiercely independent entrepreneur. They praised her alleged business acumen at every single family dinner. But the unredacted ledger on my screen told the absolute undeniable truth. Aura and Ice was not a thriving business. It was a catastrophic financial black hole. The brand had aggressively hemorrhaged money from day one. I scrolled through the expense reports. Courtney had been paying exorbitant monthly rent for premium warehouse space she did not actually use. She was heavily compensating expensive public relations marketing consultants for luxury products that did not even exist in inventory. She was pouring thousands of dollars a week into buying fake social media engagement and followers just to maintain her fragile illusion of success. When her personal trust allowance could no longer legally cover the massive compounding losses, she must have panicked completely. She needed a massive cash injection to keep the charade alive long enough to secure the wedding ring and guarantee the ultimate lifelong safety of Preston family fortune. So Richard had stepped in to save his precious golden child. He had recklessly mortgaged the family estate entirely behind my back, forged my legal signature with Preston Active help, and dumped $2 million of highly toxic debt straight into Courtney's failing fraudulent company. I did not scream. I did not throw my coffee mug at the wall or break down crying. I quietly and methodically printed every single damning ledger, every unassailable wire transfer receipt, and the forged deed of trust. I placed the thick stack of warm papers into a secure waterproof leather portfolio, grabbed my beige trench coat, and walked out of the office. I drove straight to the historic district of the city, pulling my car up to a stately brick building entirely covered in creeping green ivy. The polished brass plaque mounted by the heavy oak door read, "Arthur Bennett, Attorney at Law." Bennett had been my late grandfather's closest personal friend and his dedicated legal counsel for over 4 decades. He was the brilliant man who had explicitly helped draft the Morals and Conduct Clause. He was now mostly retired from high-stakes corporate litigation, taking only a few select estate clients to keep himself busy, but he always answered my calls. I walked into his wood-paneled office, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of old parchment paper and rich pipe tobacco. Bennett, a sharp-eyed man in his late 70s with a crown of white hair, looked up from his massive mahogany desk. He saw the grim, determined expression on my face and immediately closed the thick file he was reading. I set the heavy leather portfolio directly on his desk and opened it, sliding the freshly printed forged deed of trust toward him without saying a single word. Bennett put on his reading glasses and carefully studied the document. The silence in the room was heavy and dense, broken only by the steady rhythmic ticking of an antique grandfather clock standing in the corner. When he finally looked up, his jaw was set in a hard, uncompromising line. "This is a severe federal offense," Rebecca Bennett stated, tapping the fraudulent notary stamp with a heavy gold pen. "And if Preston was actively involved in securing this stamp, this is solid grounds for his immediate disbarment and severe criminal conspiracy charges. Your father has recklessly crossed a line he cannot ever walk back from." I know, I said, taking the comfortable leather guest chair across from him and crossing my legs. They genuinely think I am just going to roll over and cry. They think they can simply file an emergency injunction, loudly declare me mentally unfit, and sweep this entire $2 million loan under the rug before I ever even notice the house is actively facing foreclosure. Bennett let out a dry, utterly humorless laugh. Richard always was a spectacular idiot. He clearly does not realize that the Morals Clause freeze forcefully applies to any attempt to seize the trust through hostile litigation. But this blatant forgery changes the entire landscape. We do not just defend your position as the rightful trustee now, we go on the absolute offensive. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished edge of his desk. That is exactly what I want to do, Arthur. I want to build a legal trap so tight they do not even realize they are caught until the cage violently snaps shut. We spent the next 3 intensely focused hours dissecting every single financial record I had pulled from the database. We traced the exact, undeniable flow of the $2 million from Apex Holdings to Richard Offshore Intermediary account, and then straight into Courtney failing business accounts. Bennett began aggressively drafting a comprehensive fraud report, pulling the necessary federal forms to trigger an immediate devastating banking review. He prepared a secondary, equally lethal document, a formal notification to the State Bar Association regarding the highly fraudulent use of a notary stamp by a senior associate at Preston firm. We were laying down a silent, completely inescapable legal snare. My family thought they were dealing with a compliant, overly emotional daughter they could easily bully and manipulate. They had absolutely no idea they were actively dealing with a seasoned forensic auditor armed with irrefutable documented proof of massive wire fraud. Bennett handed me the final, unyielding draft of the fraud report to review. The language was sharp, absolute, and merciless. Just as my eyes scanned the damning legal terminology outlining Richard's impending federal charges, my cell phone vibrated sharply inside my coat pocket. I pulled the device out, fully expecting to see another hateful, aggressive message from Aunt Patricia, or another frantic, demanding threat from my father. Instead, a new text message from Courtney illuminated the bright screen. It was not angry. It was not demanding. It was sickly, terrifyingly sweet. "I am so sorry about everything," Rebecca, the message read. "I know tensions are incredibly high right now, and we all said things we deeply regret. Please let us do a family reconciliation dinner tonight. Just the four of us and Preston. We want to make things right. Please." I stared at the glowing message, a cold, calculating smile slowly spreading across my face. They were pivoting their entire strategy. The brutal bullying had not worked, so they were moving straight to emotional manipulation. They wanted me in a room surrounded by smiling faces to force me into signing something to save themselves. They desperately assumed that because I was the family scapegoat, I would be pathetically eager to accept any small crumb of affection they threw my way. They believed a fake apology and a free steak dinner would magically erase a decade of financial abuse and a $2 million felony. I looked up from the glowing screen and met Bennett's sharp, calculating gaze. I slowly slid the phone across the mahogany desk so he could read the message for himself. He raised an eyebrow, recognizing the blatant trap instantly. "We are going to that dinner," I told him, my voice steady and resolute. "Let them think they have won for just one more night. Let them serve me dessert while the federal banking authorities lock down their entire world." Richard's thumb hovered over the glowing screen of his cell phone, his chest heaved with angry, jagged breaths waiting for me to break. He expected the familiar pattern of our family dynamic to play out exactly as it always had. He expected me to shatter under the weight of his absolute authority. He expected me to cry, to apologize, to beg him not to take away the only thing that tied me to the family. I did none of those things. I simply stood up from the sofa. My movements were slow and deliberate. The rain beat against the large windows of my apartment, casting gray shadows across the room. I walked past my father, ignoring the dangerous shade of purple blooming on his neck, and headed straight for the heavy oak bookshelf standing against the far wall. I reached for the bottom shelf and unlocked the small fireproof safe I kept hidden behind a row of thick compliance manuals. The heavy metal door clicked open with a satisfying sound. I reached inside and pulled out the original Theodore Sterling Family Trust binder. It was a massive leather-bound volume, smelling faintly of old paper and leather conditioner. The gold-embossed letters on the cover gleamed under the living room lights. I carried the heavy binder back to the sitting area, feeling the sheer weight of my grandfather's legacy in my hands. I dropped it onto the glass coffee table with a resounding, heavy thud that made everyone in the room jump. The sudden noise shattered the tense silence, breaking Richard's intense stare. "Go right ahead and call the lawyers, Dad," I offered smoothly, tapping my fingers against the leather cover. "Call Bennett and Associates. Demand an emergency hearing. Tell the judge whatever fabricated stories you want. But before you make a complete fool of yourself in a federal courtroom, I highly suggest you refresh your memory on page 42. I opened the thick cover and began turning the heavy cream-colored pages. The parchment rustled loudly in the quiet room. Richard stared at the binder as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. He had never actually bothered to read the trust documents in their entirety. None of them had. They simply viewed the legal paperwork as a boring administrative hurdle that stood between them and their endless shopping sprees. They assumed my grandfather had just signed his vast wealth over to them and arbitrarily put my name at the top as a mere formality. I found the page I was looking for. I rotated the heavy binder 180 degrees and slid it slowly across the glass table until it stopped directly in front of Richard. "Read it," I instructed, my voice devoid of any emotion. Section 4, Paragraph 2. The Morals and Conduct Clause. Richard scoffed loudly, crossing his arms tighter against his chest. "I am not reading that legal garbage. You are making things up to save your skin. You have no authority to freeze our accounts permanently." "I do not have the authority to freeze them permanently," I agreed, leaning forward and tapping the specific paragraph with my index finger. "But I do have the explicit authority to freeze them for 6 months. And if you make that phone call to your lawyer, the freeze becomes entirely mandatory." Susan stepped forward quickly, leaning over Richard's shoulder to look at the document. Her eyes scanned the dense legal text, her lips moving slightly as she tried to comprehend the complex words. "What does it say?" she demanded, looking at her husband with growing apprehension. Richard finally lowered his phone and leaned over the table. As he read the paragraph silently, the arrogant, victorious smirk slowly melted off his face, replaced by a sickly, pale realization of his own powerlessness. "Grandfather Theodore was many things, but he was certainly not a fool," I said, leaning back into the sofa cushions. "He loved you, Dad. He really did. But he also knew exactly who and what you were. He watched you bankrupt 2 separate commercial real estate companies before you even turned 40 years old. He watched you squander millions of dollars on terrible, high-risk investments because you always wanted the quick payout without doing the actual work. Do you remember the Sterling Plaza project? You blamed the market crash, but Grandfather knew it was your absolute refusal to hire competent contractors. He knew that if he simply handed you the keys to the kingdom, the entire family fortune would be completely gone within 5 short years. That is exactly why he made me the sole trustee. He knew I respected the numbers. He knew I respected his legacy." Richard opened his mouth to argue, to loudly defend his catastrophic business failures, but I cut him off immediately. "Grandfather also knew exactly how you operate." I continued, my voice remaining calm and clinical. "He knew that the very first moment I tried to tell you no, you would try to bully me into submission. He knew you would threaten me, harass me, or try to drag me into a courtroom to strip me of my authority. That is precisely why he had his top attorneys draft the Morals and Conduct Clause. It was his ultimate failsafe to protect the trust assets from your inevitable temper tantrums." I pointed at the open page again, ensuring he was looking right at the words. "Let me summarize it for you, since reading legal text is clearly not your strong suit. The clause explicitly states that any attempt by the beneficiaries to harass, intimidate, sue, or extort the acting trustee will result in an immediate mandatory 6-month freeze of all trust assets. The moment you file an injunction claiming I am mentally unfit, the law firm is required by the strict parameters of the trust to lock down every single account for half a year. No exceptions, no appeals, no emergency allowances. If you make that call right now, Dad, you are not taking control of the trust. You are legally locking yourself out of it until the end of the year." The silence in my apartment returned, but this time it was utterly suffocating. The grim reality of their situation was finally penetrating their lifelong delusion of untouchable wealth. If they fought me, they lost everything. If they threatened me, they lost everything. I held absolutely all the cards, and for the first time in my entire life, I was not afraid to play them. Courtney was the very first one to break under the immense pressure. She let out a sound that was half gasp, half shriek. 6 months, she wailed loudly, throwing her hands in the air. 6 months. My wedding is in exactly 2 months. Preston wealthy family has already booked their first-class flights from London. We have massive deposits due today for the floral arrangements, the celebrity caterer, and the string quartet. If we do not pay the yacht broker by noon today, we lose the reservation and the non-refundable deposit completely." She spun around to face Susan, her face contorted in pure, unadulterated panic. "Mom, do something right now. You told me to ignore her text last night. You explicitly said we did not need to coddle her anymore. Tell her to fix it. My life is completely ruined. My entire wedding is ruined because you wanted to prove a point to her. Susan's eyes darted wildly between Courtney's crying face and the thick leather binder resting on the table. The polished facade of the confident, wealthy matriarch was crumbling fast, revealing the terrified woman beneath. She looked at me, her features twisting into an ugly mask of desperation and unhinged rage. "You are an absolute monster," Susan spat, taking an aggressive step toward me. Her voice was shaking with intense fury. "You are a cold, vindictive, heartless monster. Are you happy now, Rebecca? Are you satisfied with yourself? You are ruining your own sister's happiness, her one incredibly special day, over a little joke in a group chat. It was just a joke. We were just teasing you about being negative all the time, and you decide to illegally bankrupt your own family. How can you sit there so calmly and do this to your own flesh and blood?" "A joke," I repeated, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. "Telling your daughter that you are better off without her, and aggressively demanding she never speak to you again on the night of her birthday, is not a joke, Mom. It is a formal declaration of estrangement. And I am simply honoring your explicit wishes. You wanted space from me. The frozen bank accounts are now giving you plenty of space." Courtney dropped to her knees on my expensive living room rug, sobbing loudly into her hands, wailing hysterically about how Preston would immediately leave her if he found out her family actually had no money. She rocked back and forth, the very picture of a spoiled child realizing the world did not revolve around her desires. Richard was staring blankly at the wall, his phone completely forgotten in his hand. He was completely paralyzed by the horrifying realization that his ultimate legal threat had been brilliantly neutralized by a dead man. Incredible foresight. Susan was hyperventilating now, pacing frantically back and forth across my floor. Her hands were pulling at her hair, her designer rings flashing brightly in the morning light. She was muttering to herself, stringing together frantic, panicked sentences as her mind raced through the severe consequences of a 6-month financial drought. She could not comprehend a world where she could not simply buy her way out of discomfort. "It is not just the wedding," Susan gasped, her pacing becoming more erratic and desperate. "The exclusive country club dues are scheduled for tomorrow. The landscaping staff needs to be paid on Friday. Richard, do something now." She grabbed my father's arm and shook him violently, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the fabric of his expensive suit jacket. "Richard, if the accounts are frozen for 6 months, we cannot make the transfers. If we miss the payment to the private lender, they get the house. Unfreeze it now, Rebecca. Unfreeze it." The room suddenly seemed to drop 10 degrees. My heart slammed against my ribs. The sobbing from Courtney faded into distant white noise. The sound of the heavy rain against the window vanished entirely. My entire body went rigid. I slowly looked up, my eyes locking onto my mother, pale, terrified face. My mind, professionally trained to detect financial anomalies and trace hidden assets, seized immediately upon the words she had just shrieked in her blind panic. "If we miss the payment to the private lender, they get the house." I stared silently at my parents. The massive family estate in the hills, the sprawling property with the manicured lawns and the 6-car garage, was fully paid off. Grandfather Theodore had bought it in cash 30 years ago. I knew the trust ledgers inside and out. I reconciled them every single month. The estate was absolutely not mortgaged to a traditional bank. There was absolutely no logical reason for them to be making desperate payments to a private lender to keep the house. Private lenders were hard money lenders. They charged astronomical interest rates and were only used when traditional financing was impossible. My auditor instincts flared to life, bright and sharp. The only way my parents could have leveraged the family estate with a private lender was if they had somehow bypassed the trust. But the house was legally owned by the trust. Richard and Susan were merely beneficiaries who had the conditional right to reside there. They did not hold the actual deed. They possessed absolutely no legal authority to borrow money against the property. No legitimate title company or lender would ever approve a lien against an estate without the explicit notarized signature of the legally appointed trustee. They would need my signature. A cold, terrifying realization washed over me. I looked at my father, who had suddenly turned the color of ash. He was staring at Susan with a look of pure, unadulterated horror, realizing exactly what she had just confessed. My family had not just been treating me like an ATM. They had done something highly illegal. Richard's hand hovered over the screen of his phone. The threat had been made, the weapon drawn, but my absolute lack of fear caused a sudden jarring misfire in his brain. Bullies rely on the flinch. When the flinch never comes, they are the ones who lose their balance. I watched the dangerous shade of purple in his face deepen as he struggled to comprehend my defiance. He was waiting for me to break the silence, to offer a panicked compromise, to do what I had done my entire life and surrender unconditionally. I did not. Instead, I stood up from the sofa. My movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely free of the nervous energy that used to govern my existence in their presence. I walked past my father, ignoring his heavy, angry breathing, and approached the solid oak bookshelf standing against the far wall of my living room. I reached for the bottom cabinet, unlocked the heavy wooden doors, and pulled out a massive leather-bound binder. It was incredibly heavy, smelling faintly of age dust and serious money. The gold-embossed letters on the cover read, "The Theodore Sterling Family Trust." I carried it back to the sitting area, feeling the sheer weight of my grandfather's legacy resting securely in my hands. I dropped it onto the glass coffee table. The resounding heavy thud echoed sharply in the quiet room, making Courtney jump and Susan gasp. The sudden noise shattered the remaining tension, breaking Richard's intense, furious stare. "Go right ahead and call the lawyer's dad," I offered smoothly, taking my seat and crossing my legs. "Call your aggressive legal team. Demand an emergency hearing by noon. Tell the judge whatever fabricated stories you want about my mental stability. But before you make a complete fool of yourself in a federal courtroom, I highly suggest you refresh your memory on page 42. I leaned forward, flipped open the thick cover, and began turning the heavy cream-colored pages. The parchment rustled loudly. Richard stared at the binder as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. He had never actually bothered to read the trust documents in their entirety. None of them had. They simply viewed the legal paperwork as a boring administrative hurdle that stood between them and their endless shopping sprees. They assumed my grandfather had just signed his vast wealth over to them and arbitrarily put my name at the top as a mere formality. I found the page I was looking for. I rotated the heavy binder 180 degrees and slid it slowly across the glass table until it stopped directly in front of Richard. "Read it," I instructed, my voice devoid of any emotion. Section 4, Paragraph 2. The Morals and Conduct Clause. Richard scoffed loudly, crossing his arms tighter against his chest, refusing to look down. "I am not reading that legal garbage. You are making things up to save your own skin. You have absolutely no authority to freeze our accounts permanently." "I do not have the authority to freeze them permanently," I agreed, leaning forward and tapping the specific paragraph with my index finger. "But I do have the explicit, undeniable authority to freeze them for 6 months. And if you make that phone call to your lawyer, the freeze becomes entirely mandatory." Susan stepped forward quickly, leaning over Richard's shoulder to look at the document. Her eyes scanned the dense legal text, her lips moving slightly as she tried to comprehend the complex words. "What does it say?" she demanded, looking at her husband with growing apprehension. Richard finally lowered his phone and leaned over the table. As his eyes tracked across the paragraph, the arrogant, victorious smirk slowly melted off his face, replaced by a sickly, pale realization of his own utter powerlessness. "Grandfather Theodore was many things, but he was certainly not a fool," I said, leaning back into the sofa cushions. "He loved you, Dad. He really did. But he also knew exactly who and what you were. He watched you completely bankrupt 2 separate commercial real estate companies before you even turned 40 years old. He watched you squander millions of dollars on terrible high-risk investments because you always wanted the quick payout without doing the actual exhausting work. He knew that if he simply handed you the keys to the kingdom, the entire family fortune would be completely gone within 5 short years. That is exactly why he made me the sole trustee. He knew I respected the numbers. He knew I respected his legacy." Richard opened his mouth to argue, to loudly defend his catastrophic business failures, but I cut him off immediately, refusing to yield the floor. Grandfather also knew exactly how you operate. I continued, my voice remaining calm and clinical. He knew that the very first moment I tried to tell you, no, you would try to bully me into submission. He knew you would threaten me, harass me, or try to drag me into a courtroom to strip me of my authority. That is precisely why he had his top attorneys draft the morals and conduct clause. It was his ultimate fail-safe to protect the trust assets from your inevitable temper tantrums. I pointed at the open page again, ensuring he was looking right at the words. Let me summarize it for you, since reading legal text is clearly not your strong suit. The clause explicitly states that any attempt by the beneficiaries to harass, intimidate, sue, or extort the acting trustee will result in an immediate mandatory 6-month freeze of all trust assets. The moment you file an injunction claiming I am mentally unfit, the law firm is required by the strict parameters of the trust to lock down every single account for half a year. No exceptions, no appeals, no emergency allowances. If you make that call right now, Dad, you are not taking control of the trust. You are legally locking yourself out of it until the end of the year. The silence in my apartment returned, but this time it was utterly suffocating. The grim reality of their situation was finally penetrating their lifelong delusion of untouchable wealth. If they fought me, they lost everything. If they threatened me, they lost everything. I held absolutely all the cards, and for the first time in my entire life, I was not afraid to play them. Courtney was the very first one to break under the immense pressure. She let out a sound that was half gasp, half shriek. 6 months, she wailed loudly, throwing her hands in the air. 6 months. My wedding is in exactly 2 months. Preston wealthy family has already booked their first-class flights from London. We have massive deposits due today for the floral arrangements, the celebrity caterer, and the string quartet. If we do not pay the yacht broker by noon today, we lose the reservation and the non-refundable deposit completely. She spun around to face Susan, her face contorted in pure, unadulterated panic. Mom, do something right now. You told me to ignore her text last night. You explicitly said we did not need to coddle her anymore. Tell her to fix it. My life is completely ruined. My entire wedding is ruined because you wanted to prove a point to her. Susan's eyes darted wildly between Courtney's crying face and the thick leather binder resting on the table. The polished facade of the confident, wealthy matriarch was crumbling fast, revealing the terrified woman beneath. She looked at me, her features twisting into an ugly mask of desperation and unhinged rage. You are an absolute monster, Susan spat, taking an aggressive step toward me. Her voice was shaking with intense fury. You are a cold, vindictive, heartless monster. Are you happy now, Rebecca? Are you satisfied with yourself? You are ruining your own sister's happiness, her one incredibly special day, over a little joke in a group chat. It was just a joke. We were just teasing you about being negative all the time, and you decide to illegally bankrupt your own family. How can you sit there so calmly and do this to your own flesh and blood? A joke, I repeated, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. Telling your daughter that you are better off without her and aggressively demanding she never speak to you again on the night of her birthday is not a joke, Mom. It is a formal declaration of estrangement. And I am simply honoring your explicit wishes. You wanted space from me. The frozen bank accounts are now giving you plenty of space. Courtney dropped to her knees on my expensive living room rug, sobbing loudly into her hands, wailing hysterically about how Preston would immediately leave her if he found out her family actually had no money. She rocked back and forth, the very picture of a spoiled child, realizing the world did not revolve around her desires. Richard was staring blankly at the wall, his phone completely forgotten in his hand. He was completely paralyzed by the horrifying realization that his ultimate legal threat had been brilliantly neutralized by a dead man's incredible foresight. Susan was hyperventilating now, pacing frantically back and forth across my floor. Her hands were pulling at her hair, her designer rings flashing brightly in the morning light. She was muttering to herself, stringing together frantic, panicked sentences as her mind raced through the severe consequences of a 6-month financial drought. She could not comprehend a world where she could not simply buy her way out of discomfort. It is not just the wedding, Susan gasped, her pacing becoming more erratic and desperate. The exclusive country club dues are scheduled for tomorrow. The landscaping staff needs to be paid on Friday. Richard, do something now. She grabbed my father's arm and shook him violently, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the fabric of his expensive suit jacket. Richard, if the accounts are frozen for 6 months, we cannot make the transfers. If we miss the payment to the private lender, they get the house. Unfreeze it now, Rebecca. Unfreeze it. The room suddenly seemed to drop 10 degrees. My heart slammed against my ribs. The sobbing from Courtney faded into distant white noise. The sound of the heavy rain against the window vanished entirely. My entire body went rigid. I slowly looked up, my eyes locking onto my mother, pale, terrified face. My mind professionally trained to detect financial anomalies and trace hidden assets seized immediately upon the words she had just shrieked in her blind panic. If we miss the payment to the private lender, they get the house. I stared silently at my parents. The massive family estate in the hills, the sprawling property with the manicured lawns and the 6-car garage was fully paid off. Grandfather Theodore had bought it in cash 30 years ago. I knew the trust ledgers inside and out. I reconciled them every single month. The estate was absolutely not mortgaged to a traditional bank. There was absolutely no logical reason for them to be making desperate payments to a private lender to keep the house. Private lenders were hard money lenders. They charged astronomical interest rates and were only used when traditional financing was impossible. My auditor instincts flared to life bright and sharp. The only way my parents could have leveraged the family estate with a private lender was if they had somehow bypassed the trust. But the house was legally owned by the trust. Richard and Susan were merely beneficiaries who had the conditional right to reside there. They did not hold the actual deed. They possessed absolutely no legal authority to borrow money against the property. No legitimate title company or lender would ever approve a lien against an estate without the explicit notarized signature of the legally appointed trustee. They would need my signature. A cold, terrifying realization washed over me. I looked at my father, who had suddenly turned the color of ash. He was staring at Susan with a look of pure, unadulterated horror, realizing exactly what she had just confessed. My family had not just been treating me like an ATM. They had done something highly illegal. I left Arthur Bennett's mahogany-paneled office with a strange, profound sense of absolute calm. The legal snare we had spent the entire morning constructing was flawless and visible, and ready to be triggered the moment my father made his next move. Stepping out into the crisp afternoon air, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For a decade, I had operated defensively, constantly bracing for the next emotional blow or financial manipulation from my family. Now I was the one directing the current. I hailed a cab and headed straight back to my own corporate office building in the financial district. I needed to drop off the secure leather portfolio and gather a few final documents before heading home to prepare for the inevitable reconciliation dinner they had planned for that evening. The marble lobby of my building was relatively quiet for a Tuesday afternoon. The polished floors echoed with the sharp click of my heels as I crossed toward the private elevators. I was mentally reviewing the timeline Bennett and I had established when a sharp, commanding voice sliced through my concentration. "Rebecca, wait right there." I stopped and turned. Marching toward me from the plush leather waiting chairs was Aunt Patricia. My older sister was a formidable woman who wore her entitlement like a suit of armor. She was draped in cashmere, her hair perfectly styled into a stiff, immovable helmet of blonde waves. Her mouth was set in a hard, disapproving line, and her eyes flashed with self-righteous indignation. She was the family-designated enforcer the flying monkey dispatched whenever my mother needed someone else to do her dirty work while she played the delicate weeping victim. "Aunt Patricia," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "What a surprise. I did not realize you had business in my building today." "Do not play coy with me," Patricia snapped, stopping inches from my face and jabbing a manicured finger in my direction. "I am here because your mother is completely distraught." She called me absolutely hyperventilating this morning. You need to drop this ridiculous vendetta, immediately unfreeze the family accounts, and apologize for being so incredibly dramatic. I looked at her extended finger, then met her furious gaze. We are not doing this in the public lobby, Patricia. If you want to yell at me on behalf of Susan, you can do it behind closed doors. I turned on my heel and scanned my keycard at the elevator bank, leaving her no choice but to follow me into the empty cab. The ride up to the 14th floor was silent, thick with Patricia radiating anger. She was practically vibrating with the need to unleash the rest of her rehearsed tirade. The moment we stepped into my private office and the heavy glass door clicked shut behind us, she erupted. You have completely lost your mind, Rebecca. She began pacing across my office rug. How could you do this to your own parents? Freezing the trust accounts right before Courtney's wedding. Do you have any idea how much stress you are causing? Richard is working himself to the bone to provide for that family, and Susan is literally sick with worry over your vindictive behavior. You have always been jealous of Courtney, but to try and ruin her special day just to get attention is a new low even for you. I walked around my desk and set my briefcase down. I did not sit. I simply watched her pace, letting her exhaust her manufactured outrage. They are your family, Patricia continued, her voice echoing in the quiet room. You owe them respect. You owe them loyalty. Susan has sacrificed so much for you girls, and this is how you repay her. By playing petty financial games. I demand that you pick up that phone right now, call the bank, and undo whatever malicious freeze you put on their money. Are you quite finished? I asked, my tone completely conversational. Patricia stopped pacing and glared at me, crossing her arms defensively. I am waiting for you to do the right thing. The right thing, I repeated. I opened the brass clasps of my briefcase. I reached inside, bypassing the thick stack of forgery evidence, and pulled out a single neatly printed piece of paper. It was a wire transfer receipt I had discovered during my deep dive into the trust ledgers 2 nights ago. I had printed it specifically because I knew I would eventually have to deal with Patricia. I walked around the desk and stood directly in front of her. Tell me, Aunt Patricia, do you remember August of last year? Do you remember when Grandma's health took a rapid turn for the worse, and she required immediate around-the-clock palliative care? Patricia frowned, clearly thrown by the sudden change in topic. Her defensive posture slipped slightly. Of course I remember. It was a terrible time for all of us. And do you remember the urgent family meeting Susan called? I continued, keeping my eyes locked on hers. She told everyone that the insurance would not cover the specialized at-home hospice nurses. She said the trust funds were temporarily tied up in illiquid investments. She begged the extended family to chip in to make Grandma comfortable in her final weeks. She asked everyone for a contribution. You wrote her a personal check for $10,000. I wrote that check without a second thought, Patricia said, lifting her chin proudly. It was for our mother. I would have given anything to make sure she had the best care possible. Susan took care of all the arrangements. Did she? I asked softly. I held up the single sheet of paper. Then you might want to look at this. I handed her the document. Patricia took it, her brow furrowing in confusion. She pulled her reading glasses from her cashmere pocket and slid them onto her face. Her eyes scanned the top of the page, registering the official bank letterhead and the transaction codes. What is this? She muttered. That is a certified unredacted wire transfer receipt from Susan's primary checking account, I explained, stepping back and leaning against the edge of my desk. The exact account where she deposited your $10,000 check along with the contributions from Uncle David and the cousins. If you look at the date, you will see the transfer was initiated exactly 48 hours after you handed her your money. Patricia's eyes darted across the page, tracing the line items. Her breathing slowed. Look at the destination routing number I instructed, and look at the vendor name. Patricia read the line aloud, her voice barely a whisper. Maison de Luxe, Paris. That is correct, I said, my voice razor sharp. The money did not go to a hospice agency. It did not go to medical supply companies or visiting nurses. Susan wired the exact pooled amount, $25,000 in total, directly to a boutique in Paris. She used the money you gave her for your dying mother to purchase a limited edition exotic leather handbag she had been on a wait list for. Patricia physically recoiled as if the paper had burned her hands. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her normally flushed cheeks a sickly ashen gray. She stared at the receipt, her eyes reading the same line over and over again, desperately searching for a different explanation, a clerical error, a misunderstanding. But numbers do not lie, and the meticulous financial trail I had uncovered was absolute. She bought a bag. Patricia choked out, her voice cracking. Our mother was dying in a rented hospital bed in her living room, and Susan bought a bag with my money. She carried it to the funeral, I added mercilessly. The black crocodile one with the gold hardware. I am sure you complimented her on it. Patricia swayed slightly on her feet. She reached out and grabbed the back of a guest chair to steady herself. The fierce, self-righteous flying monkey who had stormed into my office just minutes ago was entirely gone. In her place stood a woman who had just realized she had been conned, manipulated, and robbed by her own sister during the most vulnerable moment of their lives. The profound silence in my office was heavy and thick. I watched the realization settle into Patricia Bones. The fierce family loyalty she had just been lecturing me about had been revealed as a one-way street, a convenient tool Susan used to extract money and compliance. She told me you were just being spiteful, Patricia whispered. Her eyes still locked on the damning receipt. She sat in my kitchen this morning, crying real tears, telling me you were trying to ruin the family out of sheer jealousy. She sent me here to bully you into unfreezing the account so Courtney could have her dream wedding. Susan is a very convincing actress, I replied, walking over and gently taking the receipt from her trembling hand. She has had decades of practice. But I deal in facts, Patricia. I deal in ledgers and routing numbers. The trust accounts are frozen because Richard and Susan committed massive financial fraud, and I am the only one standing between them and federal prison. They sent you here because they are desperate, and they knew you would fight blindly for family without asking to see the receipts. Patricia looked up at me. Her expression had transformed entirely. The anger was back, but it was no longer directed at me. It was a cold, hard fury aimed squarely at the sister who had stolen from her and exploited their mother death. She straightened her posture, taking a slow, deep breath to compose herself. You are meeting them for dinner tonight, Patricia stated, her tone entirely devoid of the earlier aggression. It was a flat, urgent statement of fact. Yes, I confirmed. A reconciliation dinner. They are hoping to smooth things over. Patricia gripped the back of the leather chair tightly, her knuckles turning white. She looked toward the closed office door, ensuring no one was lingering in the hallway, then turned back to me. She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a sharp, urgent whisper. Do not sign anything tonight, Rebecca. Do you hear me? Do not put your name on a single piece of paper they put in front of you. I narrowed my eyes, instantly alert. What do you know? When Susan was crying in my kitchen this morning, Richard was pacing in the background on the phone with Preston. Patricia whispered rapidly. They were not talking about wedding deposits or frozen accounts. Richard told Preston to make sure the transfer papers were drawn up flawlessly. He said they needed to execute the transfer tonight while you were off guard and surrounded by the family. They are not trying to reconcile with you, Rebecca. They are building a trap to force you completely out of the trust. I stared at her, my mind instantly analyzing this new variable. A transfer paper. They could not legally remove me as trustee without cause, but they could try to trick me into voluntarily signing over my proxy or power of attorney. If Preston, a licensed attorney, was bringing the documents to a public dinner, they were planning a highly coordinated ambush. Thank you, Aunt Patricia, I said quietly. She nodded once, her face set in a mask of grim determination. She turned toward the door, stopping just before she opened it. Burn them to the ground, Rebecca, she said, her voice dripping with venom. Do not leave them a single cent. The silence in my apartment stretched until it became a living, breathing entity. Richard and Susan did not say another word. The sheer gravity of Susan's accidental panicked confession had paralyzed them both. My father grabbed my mother's arm, hauling her toward the front door, without bothering to retrieve their expensive coats. Courtney scrambled after them, her tear-stained face a mask of utter confusion. They fled my apartment like criminals escaping a botched crime scene, leaving me standing alone with the absolute certainty that they had forged my signature to secure that toxic $2 million loan. I spent the next few hours meticulously documenting this new, devastating revelation, sending encrypted updates and scanned ledgers directly to Arthur Bennett. But despite their panicked retreat from my home, the schedule for the evening remained entirely unchanged. The fake reconciliation dinner they had arranged days ago was still set for 8 o'clock. They were desperate now, trapped in a shrinking corner of their own making, and desperate people always stick to the established plan when they have absolutely no other viable options. I arrived at the upscale downtown steakhouse precisely on time. The restaurant was a cavernous, intimidating space of dark mahogany paneling, soft ambient lighting, and the muted, continuous hum of immense wealth exchanging hands over prime cuts of dry-aged beef. The maitre d' escorted me to a secluded private leather booth situated in the quietest back corner of the establishment. Richard, Susan, Courtney, and Preston were already seated waiting for me. The transformation in their demeanor was incredibly jarring. The sheer, unadulterated panic from my apartment had been entirely replaced by a sickeningly sweet, overly polished facade. Susan reached across the crisp white tablecloth the moment I sat down, her hand resting lightly and affectionately near my silver presentation plate. She wore a serene, heavily practiced smile that did not quite reach the corners of her eyes. Richard immediately flagged down the sommelier and ordered a bottle of their most expensive vintage reserve wine, acting confidently, as if the morning brutal confrontation and near financial collapse had never occurred. They spent the first 30 minutes making light, breezy conversation about Courtney, upcoming wedding arrangements, and Preston, recent promotion at his prestigious corporate law firm. They were actively treating the entire week of financial abuse, brutal bullying, and felony forgery as if it were just a silly minor misunderstanding between loving family members. They poured me expensive wine, offered me the premium seafood appetizer platter, and laughed with a forced, brittle energy that made the air feel thick and suffocating. I played along seamlessly, sipping my sparkling water and offering polite, non-committal nods to their fabricated joy. The tension beneath the table was palpable, a coiled steel spring waiting to violently snap. Right before the waiter arrived to take our dessert orders, the theatrical performance abruptly shifted. Preston, sitting directly opposite me with his perfectly tailored designer suit and arrogant, relaxed posture, casually slid a thick manila folder across the polished table. It stopped squarely in front of my water glass. He offered a smooth, practiced smile that masked the absolute coldness in his eyes. He tapped the top of the folder lightly with his manicured index finger. Just some routine tax compliance forms for the estate. Rebecca, he said, his voice entirely too casual and dripping with false reassurance. The bank made a minor administrative error regarding the trustee designation filings for the upcoming fiscal quarter. If you just sign these standard update forms, it will clear up the bank error immediately, and we can all move past this highly stressful week. We just need your authorization to streamline the accounts and get the wedding payments back on track. I did not touch the folder. I simply looked down at the exposed pages protruding from the edge. My intensive forensic auditor training allowed my eyes to instantly scan, isolate, and process the dense legal jargon. It was absolutely not a routine tax compliance form. It was a full, irrevocable power of attorney transfer. The document was aggressively and maliciously drafted to strip me of every single right, privilege, and authority as the sole acting trustee, transferring complete and total control of the Sterling Family Trust directly to Richard. It even included a buried retroactive indemnity clause specifically designed to legally absolve Richard and Susan of any financial mismanagement, embezzlement, or fraud committed prior to the signing of the document. They were trying to steal the massive trust and legally bury their federal crimes in one single coordinated stroke. I slowly raised my eyes, meeting Preston's unwavering gaze. "You are a senior associate at a highly respected corporate law firm," I said softly, ensuring my voice did not carry to the adjacent tables. and you are sitting here actively participating in the fraudulent transfer of protected assets. The friendly, polished act instantly vanished from the table. The brittle smiles dropped away, revealing the ugly desperation beneath. Richard leaned forward, his elbows resting heavily on the table, invading my personal space with his physical bulk. His face hardened into a mask of pure, vicious malice. His voice dropped to a low, threatening growl that barely carried over the ambient noise of the busy restaurant. "We are done playing games, Rebecca. You are going to sign that document right now. If you do not sign it, I will walk straight into the police station tomorrow morning and have you formally arrested for the $2 million shadow debt on the house. We have all the paperwork proving you are the sole trustee. We will testify under oath that you approved the loan, squandered the money, and are now trying to maliciously blame your own parents. It is 4 against 1. Who do you think the authorities are going to believe? The respected established businessman and the corporate lawyer, or the bitter isolated daughter trying to ruin her family out of spite? Sign the paper." I stared at him, letting the full weight of his extortion wash over me. This was the exact moment they expected me to fight back. They expected outrage, fierce denial, and a loud, messy argument that they could easily overpower with sheer numbers and aggressive intimidation. Instead, I let my shoulders slump forward. I lowered my gaze to the table, forcing my breathing to become shallow and rapid, perfectly mimicking the physical response of a completely defeated, broken woman who had finally been cornered. I let a long, trembling sigh escape my lips. I reached out with a shaky hand and pulled the heavy folder closer to my chest. The entire table visibly relaxed. I could physically feel the collective exhale of relief wash over them. Courtney shot a triumphant, viciously mocking glance at Susan. Richard leaned back in his chair, his chest puffing out with arrogant, undeniable satisfaction. Preston swiftly produced an expensive gold-plated fountain pen from his breast pocket and slid it smoothly across the table toward me. I picked up the heavy pen. I turned to the final page right below the bolded line that demanded the trustee notarize signature. I pressed the nib to the thick paper and signed my name. I flipped to the second carbon copy, signed it again, and carefully closed the folder. I slid the documents and the pen back across the table to Preston. He snatched the folder eagerly, his eyes practically gleaming with the thrill of victory. I did not say a single word. I slowly stood up from the leather booth. I reached into my purse, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and dropped it onto the white tablecloth to cover the cost of my sparkling water. I turned my back on their victorious, gloating smiles and walked straight out of the restaurant, leaving them to celebrate their hollow, temporary triumph. The cold, biting night air hit my face as I stepped out onto the bustling sidewalk, but my blood was running hot with pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I retrieved my car from the valet and merged into the heavy evening traffic. The moment I was safely enclosed in the quiet, secure cabin of my vehicle, I connected my phone to the Bluetooth system and dialed Arthur Bennett's private mobile number. He answered on the first ring. "It is done," I told him, my voice steady, sharp, and completely devoid of the defeated, trembling act I had just performed inside the steakhouse. They presented the irrevocable power of attorney transfer. Richard explicitly threatened to frame me for the $2 million fraudulent loan and have me arrested if I refused to sign it. Bennett let out a sharp, approving breath over the speaker. "And I assume you executed the contingency protocol." I smiled, the soft glow of the dashboard illuminating the deep satisfaction in my eyes. "Perfectly. I did not sign my actual legal signature. I used the duress signature. Years ago, when I first took over the massive, complex responsibilities of the family trust, I sat down with the highest level executives and security directors at our primary financial institution. We established a highly classified, registered security protocol specifically designed for severe extortion scenarios. My standard legally binding signature features a distinct leftward tilt on the capital R and a sharp aggressive cross on the lowercase t. My duress signature, however, is subtly but mathematically different. The R loops slightly to the right, and the T is left completely uncrossed. To the untrained eye, to arrogant, overconfident men like Richard and Preston, it looks like a slight, meaningless variation caused by a shaky, terrified hand. but to the bank automated security scanners and the elite fraud department. It is the equivalent of pulling a silent, blaring fire alarm during an active bank robbery. It is a registered, coded signal that explicitly indicates the trustee is signing the document under direct physical threat extortion or severe duress. I parked my car in my secure garage, calculating the timeline in my head. Preston was intensely arrogant, but he was also highly efficient and desperate to secure Courtney wedding funds. He would not wait until the morning to process his massive victory. He would want the transfer secured immediately to guarantee the liquid funds. 10 minutes later, across the city, Preston drove his luxury sedan straight to the 24-hour commercial branch of our primary bank. He confidently bypassed the regular line and approached the high-net-worth client teller, sliding the signed manila folder across the marble counter with a smug, self-satisfied grin. He loudly demanded an immediate execution of the power of attorney transfer and full unrestricted access to the primary trust accounts. The teller, strictly following standard operating protocol for high-value asset transfers, took the document and fed the final signature page directly into the automated verification scanner. The machine whirred quietly, analyzing the precise ink patterns and comparing them instantly to the master security file. As soon as the optical scanner registered the rightward looping R and the uncrossed T, the system recognized the exact pre-programmed parameters of the duress signature. No audible alarms sounded in the marble lobby. No red lights flashed overhead. Preston stood there casually checking his expensive watch, completely oblivious to the fact that the teller's secure monitor had just locked down, entirely flashing a stark, bright red emergency code. In that single invisible instant, silent high-priority alarms triggered across the entire federal banking network, instantly flagging every single transaction, permanently freezing every family asset, and automatically dispatching an urgent, unavoidable alert to the Federal Fraud Investigation Division. My phone vibrated sharply on the marble vanity just as I was clasping a diamond tennis necklace around my throat. I picked up the device, my eyes locking onto the urgent notification illuminating the screen. It was an automated alert from the county clerk office. Apex Holdings. The shadow lender Richard had recklessly borrowed $2 million from had officially initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings on my parents' estate due to severe missed payments. The aggressive predatory firm wasted absolutely no time. They smelled blood in the water. I opened my secure offshore investment portfolio interface. I had quietly amassed a significant personal fortune through my own forensic consulting firm, entirely separate from the Sterling Family Trust. I located the specific distressed debt package listed on the private exchange. Without a single moment of hesitation, I tapped the screen and clicked Purchase Debt. The transaction cleared instantly. I was now the sole legal owner of the predatory loan, holding my parents' primary residence hostage. If they failed to pay, the estate would not go to a faceless corporation. It would go directly to me. I slipped the phone into my silver evening clutch, smoothed down the fabric of my emerald green silk gown, and walked out the door. The annual Sterling Family Charity Gala was being held at the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive hotel. The opulent venue was a testament to the family's desperate need to maintain their fragile illusion of immense wealth and untouchable social superiority. As I handed my keys to the valet and stepped through the massive brass doors, the sheer scale of their hypocrisy hit me like a physical wave. They were hosting a lavish black tie event to raise money for underprivileged youth, while simultaneously attempting to embezzle millions of dollars from their own flesh and blood. I walked into the crowded ballroom, my head held high, my posture projecting absolute unyielding confidence. The space was packed with the city elite politicians, corporate executives, and old money aristocrats dripping in diamonds. Almost immediately the whispers started. The ambient hum of polite conversation dropped noticeably as I made my way toward the center of the room. I could feel the heavy, judgmental stares burning into my back. Just that morning, Susan had posted a highly theatrical, tearful video to her private social media network. which conveniently included every single member of our extended family. In the video, she sat in her dimly lit living room, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue, claiming I had suffered a severe mental breakdown. She spun a tragic, entirely fabricated tale of my paranoid delusions, claiming I was aggressively trying to ruin my younger sister's wedding out of bitter, misplaced jealousy. Aunt Patricia stood near the champagne tower, glaring at me with open disgust. Several of my cousins quickly turned their backs as I approached, shielding their faces behind crystal flutes of expensive wine. They had all swallowed Susan-manufactured victimhood hook, line, and sinker. They viewed me as the unstable, vindictive spinster, desperately trying to tear down my loving family. I ignored their dirty looks completely. Their petty judgments meant absolutely nothing in the face of the federal avalanche currently hurtling toward them. I spotted the guests of honor holding court near the main stage. Richard looked like a king surveying his kingdom, a glass of expensive scotch resting comfortably in his hand. Susan was clinging to his arm, beaming brilliantly at a local judge, her morning tears miraculously cured by the validation of high society. Courtney and Preston stood nearby, the picture-perfect wealthy couple. Preston was smiling smoothly, radiating the smug, arrogant satisfaction of a man who believed he had just successfully pulled off the ultimate financial coup. They were all blissfully, completely unaware that the federal government was actively tearing through their entire lives at that exact moment. They did not know that Richard and Susan's personal checking accounts had been frozen. They did not know that Courtney business accounts were locked down by federal investigators. They did not know that Preston's secure escrow accounts at his prestigious law firm were currently being seized by banking authorities. They thought they had won. I secured a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and positioned myself near a tall floral arrangement, silently watching the performance. The ignorance was truly staggering. They were dancing on the edge of a sheer cliff, celebrating their victory, while the ground was actively crumbling beneath their expensive shoes. A sharp chime rang through the ballroom as the event coordinator tapped a spoon against a microphone. The scattered conversations slowly died down, and the wealthy crowd directed their attention toward the elevated stage at the front of the room. Richard handed his scotch to Susan, straightened his designer tuxedo jacket, and climbed the carpeted stairs. He stepped up to the podium, adjusting the microphone with practiced ease. The massive projection screens behind him displayed the elegant looping logo of the Sterling Family Charity Foundation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his deep, resonant voice projecting perfectly across the silent ballroom. His tone was warm, commanding, and saturated with false humility. "Thank you all for joining us tonight to support such a vital and worthy cause. Family has always been the cornerstone of the Sterling legacy. My father, Theodore Sterling, built this foundation on the unwavering belief that those who are blessed with abundance have a solemn, sacred duty to lift up those who are struggling." A soft murmur of polite, appreciative applause rippled through the audience. Susan dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the role of the devoted, supportive wife to absolute perfection. But family is also about resilience. Richard continued, his expression shifting into a mask of deep, manufactured sorrow. "It is about supporting one another through the darkest, most difficult times. As many of you know, the burden of managing a legacy like ours can be incredibly heavy. Recently, that weight has proven to be too much for my eldest daughter, Rebecca." He paused, letting the silence stretch for dramatic effect. He looked out at the audience, projecting the perfect image of a heartbroken but understanding father. "Mental health is a serious battle, and it is a battle we must fight with compassion," he said smoothly. "Rebecca has been struggling immensely. She has unfortunately been dealing with severe paranoid episodes and a deep emotional crisis. We love her dearly, and we are committed to getting her the professional help she so desperately needs. To allow her the time and space to heal, Rebecca has officially stepped down from her role as the head of the Sterling Family Trust." Another murmur swept through the room, this one laced with pity and quiet judgment. I saw several relatives nodding sympathetically at Susan, completely buying into the tragic narrative. I remained perfectly still, my expression entirely blank, watching Richard build his own public execution block. "But the Sterling legacy must continue," Richard announced, his voice rising with triumphant energy as he gestured toward the front row. And so it is my profound honor to announce that the reins of our family trust will be handed over to my brilliant, capable, and dedicated daughter, Courtney. She has shown incredible business acumen with her own successful ventures, and she is fully prepared to guide our family into a bright, prosperous future. Please join me in congratulating the new head of the Sterling Family Trust, Courtney Sterling. The ballroom erupted into enthusiastic applause. Courtney stood up, glowing under the warm lights, and waved graciously to the clapping crowd. Preston wrapped his arm around her waist, looking incredibly proud of the massive financial empire he believed he had just helped them steal. Richard beamed from the stage, opening his arms to welcome his golden child up to the podium. It was the perfect, triumphant climax to their elaborate scheme. I set my water glass down on a nearby cocktail table. I smoothed the skirt of my emerald gown, stepped out from the shadows of the floral arrangement, and walked calmly toward the center of the room. A secondary microphone stand was positioned near the sound mixing board, intended for audience questions during the charity auction segment of the evening. I moved with absolute, unwavering purpose. The crowd nearest to me parted slightly, their applause faltering as they noticed my approach. Before Courtney could even place her foot on the first step leading up to the stage, before the applause could reach its peak, I reached the secondary microphone. I pulled it smoothly from the stand, the sharp feedback screeching briefly through the massive speakers, instantly silencing the entire ballroom. The sudden jarring noise cut through the applause like a physical blade. Hundreds of wealthy guests turned their heads simultaneously, their eyes locking onto me. Richard froze on the stage, his triumphant smile slipping. Susan gasped aloud, her hand flying to her throat. Courtney stopped dead in her tracks, her gracious wave dying in the air. Preston's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Thank you for the introduction, Dad," I said, my voice echoing loud, clear, and perfectly steady across the massive room. The acoustics amplified my calm, uncompromising tone, ensuring every single person heard me perfectly. But as the legal standing trustee of the Sterling Family Trust, I have a different announcement regarding our family finances. I did not wait for Richard to react. I did not give him a single second to shout me down or demand my microphone be cut off. I looked past the stage, aiming my gaze directly at the elevated sound booth at the back of the room. I caught the eye of the AV technician, a highly skilled private contractor, and a trusted contact Arthur Bennett had specifically hired for this exact event. I gave him a single sharp nod. The technician's fingers flew across the mixing board. The massive projection screens behind Richard, which had proudly displayed the elegant charity logo just a second ago, flickered and violently shifted. The room was suddenly bathed in a harsh, glaring white light. The screens flashed, displaying a massive, unredacted, high-resolution image. It was a bright red federal fraud alert document, issued directly by the United States Department of the Treasury. The bold black letters screamed across the top of the screens, "Mandatory asset seizure" and "Federal audit initiated." Underneath the glaring headline were the specific names and account numbers, completely unblurred and visible to every single person in the room. Richard Sterling, Susan Sterling, Courtney Sterling, and Preston Vance. The entire ballroom descended into a state of absolute paralyzed shock. The silence was deafening, broken only by the quiet hum of the projectors broadcasting their ruin to the world. "Let us look closely at the screen," I instructed, my voice cutting through the thick, frozen atmosphere of the grand ballroom like a surgical blade. I turned slightly, gesturing toward the massive digital display, glowing brightly behind my paralyzed father. The AV technician, following the precise sequence Arthur Bennett and I had mapped out down to the second, hit a button on his mixing board. The glaring red federal fraud alert instantly dissolved. In its place, a crisp, high-resolution scan of a legal document appeared, magnified so large that every single clause, comma, and signature filled the entire backdrop of the stage. The wealthy attendees leaned forward in their seats. The absolute quiet of the room was suddenly punctuated by the soft, rapid clicking of hundreds of smartphone cameras snapping photos. Socialites, business moguls, and local politicians were eagerly documenting the spectacular collapse of the Sterling family facade. "What you are looking at is a commercial lending agreement," I explained calmly, maintaining steady eye contact with the sea of shocked faces. Specifically, it is a shadow loan originated by Apex Holdings, a private hard money lender known for astronomical interest rates and predatory collection tactics. My parents, Richard and Susan Sterling, secretly initiated this $2 million loan against the primary family estate. They did this because they had completely exhausted their personal credit and required an immediate influx of cash to fund a lavish $250,000 wedding for my sister Courtney. However, there was a significant legal obstacle standing in their way. The family estate is solely owned by the Sterling Family Trust. My parents are merely beneficiaries with residency privileges. They do not hold the deed. They possess absolutely no legal authority to borrow money against that property. No legitimate financial institution would ever approve a massive lien against an estate without the explicit notarized signature of the legally appointed trustee. I paused, letting the heavy implications of my words settle over the elite crowd. I looked directly at Richard. His face had drained of all color, transforming his previously arrogant expression into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium so tightly his knuckles were stark white. He opened his mouth to shout a denial, but his throat worked soundlessly, entirely betrayed by his own panic. I signaled the sound booth again. The massive projection screen shifted, zooming in closely on the bottom of the final page of the loan agreement. Two distinct signatures filled the digital canvas side by side. Because they desperately needed the money to maintain their fraudulent lifestyle, they decided to bypass the law entirely. I continued, my voice echoing clearly through the massive speakers. On the left side of the screen, you will see my actual verified legal signature pulled directly from the Bankmaster security file. Please note the specific angle of the capital letter R and the sharp, distinct cross on the lowercase t. Now look at the signature on the right. That is the signature present on the $2 million Apex Holdings loan document. Notice how the R loops lazily to the right. Notice how the T is completely uncrossed. That is not my signature. I did not sign that document. I was never informed of this loan. My parents willfully and maliciously forged my name to illegally extract $2 million against an estate they do not own. A collective gasp ripped through the ballroom. The polite murmurs instantly escalated into a chaotic symphony of shocked whispers and disgusted exclamations. Forgery was a dirty, desperate crime, one that the high society crowd found utterly reprehensible. But a forged signature on a federal lending document requires a professional enabler to pass the initial underwriting process. I signaled the technician for the third time. The screen shifted once more, highlighting a small, perfectly stamped ink seal located directly beneath the forged signature. As many of you know, a loan of this magnitude requires a legally certified witness, I stated, turning my gaze slowly toward the front row of VIP tables. It requires a licensed notary public to officially swear under penalty of perjury that they personally verified the identity of the signatory. Please direct your attention to the notary stamp validating the forged signature. It belongs to Preston Vance. I pointed directly at Preston, who was sitting at the primary family table. He looked as though all the air had been violently sucked out of his lungs. His confident, arrogant posture had completely collapsed. He was staring at the massive projection screen with wide, horrified eyes, his mouth hanging open in silent disbelief. Preston Vance is a senior associate at one of the most prestigious corporate law firms in this city, I announced, ensuring every single syllable hit with devastating precision. He is an officer of the court. He utilized his professional credentials, his legal authority, and his firm official seal to validate a forged document, actively participating in a massive conspiracy to commit wire fraud and grand larceny. He did this to secure the stolen funds paying for his own extravagant wedding. The reaction from this front row was instantaneous and explosive. Sitting directly adjacent to the Sterling family table were the senior managing partners of Preston Law Firm. They had been invited as esteemed guests of honor, utilized as high-profile props to bolster the family's social standing. The moment the notary stamp filled the screen displaying their prestigious firm name alongside the fraudulent authorization, the three senior partners stood up in absolute unison. The blood had drained from their faces, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. Their firm, pristine reputation was actively being dragged into a federal felony investigation in front of the entire city elite. The lead managing partner, a formidable man named Harrison, did not hesitate. He stepped away from his expensive dinner plate and walked directly over to Preston. Harrison ignored the surrounding chaos, his voice slicing through the noise with chilling professional authority. "You are an absolute disgrace," Harrison stated, his voice carrying just enough volume to be picked up by the nearby microphones. "You have compromised the integrity of this firm and implicated us in a federal crime. You are fired, Preston. Effective immediately. Do not come into the office tomorrow. Do not attempt to log into the servers. Our security team will box up your desk and courier your personal items to your apartment. You will be hearing from our legal counsel regarding the catastrophic damage you have caused." Preston crumbled. He sank lower into his expensive dining chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. The wealthy, successful future he had arrogantly planned had just been entirely obliterated in less than 60 seconds. He had traded his law license and his freedom for a fraudulent wedding budget, and the reality of his devastating miscalculation was finally crushing him. A sudden piercing shriek shattered the remaining decorum in the ballroom. Courtney leapt up from the table, her designer evening gown catching on the edge of her chair and ripping audibly. She ignored the torn fabric, sprinting toward the stage with the manic, unhinged energy of a cornered wild animal. She scrambled up the carpeted stairs, her expensive high heels slipping, causing her to fall forward and scrape her knees. She crawled the rest of the way, scrambling past Richard's paralyzed legs, and lunged desperately for the audiovisual equipment stationed behind the podium. "Turn it off!" Courtney screamed, her voice cracking hysterically. "Turn that screen off right now! You are lying! You are ruining my wedding! Turn it off!" She clawed frantically at the thick bundles of cables running along the back of the stage, yanking and pulling blindly. She managed to rip a secondary power cord from its socket. The massive projection screen flickered for a fraction of a second, causing Courtney to let out a brief, manic sob of triumph. But the AV technician Arthur Bennett had hired was a seasoned professional. He had installed redundant backup systems specifically for this eventuality. The screen stabilized instantly, the glaring evidence of their federal crimes shining brighter than ever. Courtney dropped to the stage floor, her perfectly styled hair falling in messy strands across her tear-streaked face, sobbing uncontrollably as she hit the wooden floorboards with her bare fists. Below the stage, Susan completely abandoned her polished matriarch persona. She began hyperventilating loudly, her chest heaving as she dramatically clutched her pearl necklace. She looked wildly around the room, searching desperately for a single sympathetic face among the wealthy crowd. She found absolutely none. The attendees were watching her with a mixture of profound disgust and morbid fascination. "You are a monster!" "Rebecca," Susan wailed loudly, leaning heavily against the edge of the stage, deliberately attempting to stage a fainting spell. No one rushed forward to catch her. She slumped awkwardly to the carpet, crying out in a shrill, piercing voice. "You are destroying your own flesh and blood. You are ruining everything. We just wanted Courtney to be happy. How could you do this to us?" I stood perfectly still at the center microphone, my posture rigid, and my expression utterly devoid of sympathy. I watched the chaotic, humiliating meltdown of the people who had terrorized me for my entire existence. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical satisfaction. They were finally experiencing the exact devastation they had relentlessly inflicted upon me. Richard finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. The illusion of his absolute control had been completely shattered, leaving behind nothing but raw, desperate fury. He pushed past Courtney's sobbing form on the stage and marched to the very edge of the platform. He pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at my face, his chest heaving with exertion. He abandoned all pretense of the wealthy, dignified philanthropist. He was a desperate, ruined man lashing out wildly. "You think you have won?" Richard bellowed, his voice echoing through the ballroom without the need for a microphone. You think exposing this loan makes you the victor? You are evicting your own parents. You froze the trust accounts, and because of your malicious, vindictive actions, we missed the critical payments. Apex Holdings is taking the house tomorrow. The ballroom erupted into a cacophony of gasps, shocked whispers, and the clattering of silverware dropped by startled guests. My father, Richard, stood on that stage, his face a mottled, terrified purple, his grip on the podium the only thing keeping him from collapsing. He stared at the massive projection screen, his eyes frantically darting over the legal language of the Apex Holdings debt purchase agreement that now dominated the room courtesy of the AV feed I had seamlessly hijacked. The document was unmistakable. My signature as the new creditor was clear, bold, and final. I did not let the silence linger. I turned away from the secondary microphone and stepped out from behind the sound booth, my gaze fixed on my father. I am not evicting you because I am spiteful, Richard, I called out, my voice cutting through the pandemonium without the need for amplification. I am evicting you because you broke the law. You signed away the security of your family home for a party, for a dress, and for the hollow prestige of a status you could no longer afford. I did not ruin this family. Your insatiable greed did that all on its own. My father's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. He looked around the ballroom, his eyes searching for an ally, for someone to tell him this was a nightmare, but he found only horrified, judging gazes. The power he had wielded over me, the leverage he had used to bully me into silence, had evaporated the moment I pressed that button on my phone. Outside, the first faint, rhythmic wail of sirens began to cut through the heavy night air. It started as a distant, almost imperceptible sound, but it grew with terrifying speed, echoing off the high-rise buildings surrounding the hotel. Preston Vance, who had been sitting in his chair in a state of catatonic shock, finally moved. He tried to stand, his legs buckling beneath him, as he made a desperate, pathetic lunge for the side exit. He did not make it 3 steps. 2 uniformed police officers, accompanied by a lead detective from the Federal Fraud Division, pushed through the heavy brass doors of the ballroom. They did not rush. They did not need to. They moved with the cold, measured precision of men who had been waiting for the exact moment the fraud was confirmed. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a wide, hollow aisle that led straight to the main table where the Sterling family sat. The sound of the sirens outside spiked, then cut out abruptly as the vehicles screeched to a halt at the hotel entrance. The ballroom doors remained open, the cool night air mixing with the stifling heat of the gala. Every eye was locked on the officers as they crossed the floor. Preston stopped moving entirely, his hands raised instinctively in a surrender gesture that looked like a prayer. The lead detective stopped at our table, his gaze sweeping from my parents to the disgraced attorney. Preston Vance. The detective stated, his voice booming and utterly devoid of emotion. You are under arrest for notary fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and the forgery of federal lending documents. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back. Susan let out a sharp, guttural sound, something between a scream and a sob. She surged forward, shoving past the waiters and the stunned guests, her movements frantic and uncoordinated. She did not go to Preston. She went straight to me. She dropped to her knees on the expensive ballroom carpet, her perfectly manicured hands clawing at the hem of my emerald silk gown. The cold, calculated composure she had projected for the last hour had vanished, leaving behind a desperate, weeping woman whose only remaining instinct was to claw at the source of her downfall. "Rebecca, please!" she begged, her mascara running in dark, jagged tracks down her pale cheeks. "You have to stop this. You have to tell them it was all a terrible misunderstanding. We are your family. Look at us. We are your mother and father. You cannot let them take your father, and you cannot let them ruin Courtney's life. Think about the legacy. Think about what people will say." I looked down at her. I did not move. I did not flinch. I did not reach out to help her up. I simply stood there, my silhouette framed by the harsh, unrelenting glare of the projection screens that continued to display the evidence of their betrayal. I felt the sharp, cold clarity that had guided me for the last few months. This was the conclusion of their theater, the final scene they had written for me, where I was expected to play the role of the martyr, the one who sacrificed her own future to save their sinking ship. I looked at the judge, the politicians, and the peers who had been their audience for years. They were all watching now. They were watching the curtain pull back. I looked at the floor where Courtney was still huddled, her face buried in her hands, the ruined dress a testament to her shattered vanity. Then I looked back down at my mother, who was still clutching my skirts, pleading for a mercy she had never once extended to me in my entire life. "Do you remember what you said to me last month, Susan?" I asked, my voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "Do you remember when I tried to tell you that the trust was collapsing? When I tried to warn you that we were heading toward a financial cliff? You told me I was a liability. You told me I was better off without you, and that you were better off without me. I am just honoring your wishes. I am giving you the space you asked for." I gently but firmly detached her fingers from the silk of my dress. I stepped back, creating a barrier between us that was far more significant than the few feet of ballroom carpet. The lead detective signaled the officers who moved in to secure Richard. My father did not fight. The fight had been drained from him the moment the Apex Holdings foreclosure notice appeared on the screen. He slumped as they pulled his arms behind his back, the handcuffs clicking shut with a finality that silenced the room. The officers then moved to Preston, who was still trembling in his chair. He was led away in silence, his face a ghost of the arrogance he had displayed just an hour prior. The ballroom was a tomb of hushed gasps and stunned disbelief. The gala, intended to be a night of celebration and grand announcements, had been transformed into a public execution of the family reputation. I turned my back on the stage, on the weeping woman on the floor, and on the ruins of the Sterling legacy. I walked toward the exit, my path clear, my heart steady. As I reached the doors, I caught the eye of Aunt Patricia. She was standing by the champagne tower, her glass held tightly in her hand, her face unreadable. For a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. It might have been shock, or perhaps the cold dawning awareness of her own vulnerability. I did not offer her a smile. I did not offer her an acknowledgement. I simply walked out of the ballroom into the lobby and toward the hotel entrance. The night air was cold and refreshing. I stopped at the valet station, my car appearing within seconds. As the valet held the door open for me, I paused, looking back at the hotel facade. The lights of the ballroom windows still flickered with the frantic movement of a crowd in chaos. They had spent years crafting the perfect image, building a world where their every whim was serviced and their every action hidden behind the veil of influence. They had truly believed their own lies. They had lived as if they were exempt from the rules that governed everyone else, as if they could rewrite reality by sheer force of personality. But reality has a way of asserting itself eventually. It does not care about legacies or social circles, or who has the best tailor in the city. It cares about numbers. It cares about truth. And tonight the truth had been the most devastating weapon of all. I pulled my phone from my clutch and checked my notifications. A flood of emails from the federal investigators, from the bank administrators, and from the foreclosure department were waiting for me. Each one was a step forward, a tightening of the knot. The house would be vacated by the end of the week. The trust accounts were effectively shuttered, undergoing a top-to-bottom forensic audit that would take months, if not years, to complete. Every asset, every property, every investment that had been purchased with stolen trust money was already flagged for recovery. I started the engine, the low hum of the car, the only sound in the quiet garage. I pulled out onto the street, the city lights moving past in a blur of gold and white. I was not heading home to an empty house. I was heading to a future I had built by my own hand, one that wasn't tethered to the names of Sterling or Susan or Richard. I had done what I had promised myself. I had stepped out of their shadow, and I had done it by holding up a mirror and forcing them to see their own reflection. The drive was quiet. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't need the distraction. I was finally truly alone with my thoughts, and for the first time in a long time, my thoughts were peaceful. The drama, the betrayal, the forgery, the gala, it was all behind me. I had survived the trap they had set, and in the process, I had created a much more effective one of my own. As the skyline of the city receded in my rearview mirror, I realized I had not just saved my own future. I had saved the spirit of everything my grandfather had intended for that trust. It wouldn't be wasted on handbags and weddings. It would be used for what it was designed for: growth, sustainability, and real lasting impact. I realized then that I hadn't just destroyed the family image. I had liberated myself from the burden of maintaining it. I had been their trustee in name, but tonight I became the executor of their fate. I steered the car toward the highway, the road ahead open and clear, a path illuminated by the bright, honest, and entirely mine light of the future. The Sterling name would be a warning in the legal records for a long time, but my name, Rebecca, would be the one remembered as the woman who stood against them when no one else dared. It was enough. It was more than enough. I drove on, never looking back at the life I had discarded, finally free to begin the life I had earned. "Apex Holdings is not taking the house, Dad," I replied, my voice slicing through the heavy, suffocating silence of the grand ballroom. I offered him a cold, unyielding smile that held absolutely no warmth or hesitation. "I am taking it." I raised my left hand, holding my phone high enough for the AV technician in the sound booth to see my signal. With a single deliberate press of my thumb against the illuminated glass screen, I triggered the next sequence. The massive projection displays behind my father flickered once more. The glaring red federal fraud alert vanished entirely instantly, replaced by a stark, heavily redacted legal document. The bold black letters printed at the top of the page spelled out a comprehensive, irrevocable debt purchase agreement. I pointed up at the screens, ensuring every single person in the room could see the absolute finality of their financial ruin. "My private forensic compliance firm bought your bad debt from Apex Holdings this very afternoon." I explained, my words echoing sharply across the cavernous space. "The exact moment the shadow lender initiated the foreclosure proceedings due to your gross financial negligence, the debt became a distressed asset on the private exchange. I purchased the entire loan package in full. I am now the sole undisputed legal owner of the primary family estate. You do not hold the deed, and you no longer have a lender willing to tolerate your endless excuses. You have exactly zero leverage left. You have nowhere else to run." Richard stared at the glowing projection screens, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The purple, furious coloring in his face rapidly drained away, leaving him a pale, sickly shade of gray. The absolute reality of his situation was finally penetrating his thick skull. He had gambled the family home on a fraudulent scheme, assuming he could easily intimidate me into covering his corrupt tracks. Instead, he had handed me the very weapon required to evict him. He looked down at me from the edge of the stage, his eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of shock, profound confusion, and undeniable fear. He had spent his entire life bullying people into submission, using his booming voice and aggressive physical presence to force compliance. Now stripped of his wealth, his reputation, and his stolen assets, he was nothing more than a pathetic, desperate man standing on a stage he no longer owned. The silence in the grand ballroom was sudden and absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic wailing of emergency sirens echoing through the downtown streets. The high-pitched sound started as a faint hum, but grew rapidly, slicing through the crisp night air and bleeding into the opulent venue. The sirens were not a coincidence. While I was standing in my corporate office executing the debt purchase, Arthur Bennett had been sitting in the district attorney office, formally submitting the comprehensive unredacted file of forgery evidence, complete with Preston verified notary stamp and the fraudulent transfer documents. He had handed the federal authorities a perfectly wrapped, undeniable case of grand larceny, wire fraud, and criminal conspiracy. The flashing red and blue lights reflected brightly against the massive glass windows of the hotel lobby, casting eerie, rotating shadows across the marble floors. The heavy brass doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a violent, heavy thud. 6 uniformed police officers, accompanied by 2 lead detectives wearing dark suits and grim expressions, stepped into the room. They did not pause to assess the situation. They moved with the cold, calculated precision of professionals executing a high-priority, coordinated arrest warrant. The sea of wealthy socialites, corporate executives, and local politicians instantly parted, creating a wide, silent path straight down the center aisle. The guests pressed themselves against the linen-draped tables, their eyes wide with morbid, undeniable fascination, as they watched the authorities march directly toward the primary family table. Preston parents, who were seated in the front row, finally broke out of their paralyzed state. The wealthy aristocratic couple stood up in absolute unison, their faces twisted into masks of pure, unadulterated horror. They looked at their son, who was still trembling violently in his chair, and then they looked at Courtney, who was sobbing hysterically on the stage floor. Preston's mother reached down, snatched her expensive evening clutch from the table, and glared at my sister. "The wedding is permanently cancelled," she announced, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "Do not ever attempt to contact our family again." Without another word, the wealthy couple turned their backs on the collapsing spectacle and walked briskly out of the ballroom, officially severing the final tether to Courtney high society dreams. Courtney let out a raw, agonizing shriek, burying her face in the torn fabric of her designer gown. Her entire future, the lavish wedding, the wealthy husband, the elevated social status had just evaporated in front of the entire city elite. But the police officers did not spare her a single glance. The lead detective stepped up to the edge of the stage, his eyes locked firmly on my father. "Richard Sterling," the detective stated, his voice booming over the ambient noise of the terrified crowd, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, grand larceny, and the forgery of federal lending documents. Step down from the stage and place your hands behind your back." Richard stumbled backward, his hands raised defensively in front of his chest. "This is a massive misunderstanding," he stammered, his booming voice reduced to a pathetic, trembling whine. "You cannot do this. I am a respected businessman. I have powerful friends. I know the mayor. This is a private family dispute. You are making a terrible mistake." Two uniformed officers bypassed the short staircase and vaulted directly onto the stage. They grabbed Richard by the arms, spinning him around with practiced, unrelenting force. The sharp, metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoing through the ballroom sounded like a gunshot. Richard gasped, his knees buckling slightly, as the reality of his arrest physically restrained him. He looked out at the crowd, searching desperately for a friendly face, someone to intervene on his behalf. But the sea of high society guests simply stared back, their expressions cold, judging, and entirely unsympathetic. His reputation was permanently obliterated. Below the stage, the second detective approached Preston. The arrogant, slick corporate lawyer did not attempt to run or argue. He simply sat in his chair, staring blankly at the polished silverware in front of him. The officers pulled his arms behind his back, securing the cuffs tightly around his wrists. Preston slowly lifted his head, making brief, terrifying eye contact with his former senior managing partners, who were standing nearby watching his arrest with profound, unapologetic satisfaction. He had traded his entire legal career for a shortcut to wealth, and the gamble had completely destroyed his life. He was escorted down the center aisle, his head bowed low, completely broken. The officers hauled Richard down from the stage, marching him toward the exit. As they passed my position near the center microphone, Richard strained against the officer's grip, turning his furious, tear-streaked face toward me. "You will pay for this, Rebecca," he hissed, his voice cracking with desperate, impotent rage. "You will burn in hell for what you have done to your own family." I did not offer him a response. I simply watched him being dragged out of the grand ballroom, his wealthy, untouchable facade stripped away entirely, leaving nothing but a desperate, cornered criminal facing the absolute consequences of his own boundless greed. The moment the doors closed, the remaining tension shattered into a deafening roar of gossip. A frantic movement caught my attention. Susan pushed herself up from the carpeted floor near the edge of the stage. Her face was red and blotchy, her expensive makeup ruined. She stumbled forward, practically throwing herself at my feet. She grabbed my arm, her manicured fingers digging painfully into the silk fabric of my evening gown. She was nothing more than a terrified, broken woman, begging for salvation from the daughter she had spent decades tormenting. "Rebecca, please," Susan pleaded, her voice high-pitched and frantic. "You have to call the police and tell them it was a terrible misunderstanding. Tell them you gave us permission to sign those papers. We are your family. We are your flesh and blood. You cannot let them take your father to prison. You cannot let them lock us out of our home. We will do whatever you want. Just make this nightmare stop." I slowly reached down and detached her trembling fingers from my dress. I stepped back, creating an undeniable physical boundary between us. I looked down at her terrified, tear-stained face, my expression perfectly calm and completely resolved. "You said you were better off without me," I stated, my voice echoing with quiet, absolute finality. "I am just giving you the space you asked for." The flashing red and blue lights reflecting against the grand ballroom windows painted a fittingly chaotic backdrop for the final collapse of the Sterling family. The heavy brass doors swung open, admitting a team of uniformed police officers and 2 federal detectives. They moved with terrifying precision, their expressions completely devoid of sympathy, as they approached the primary table. They instructed Richard and Preston to stand up and place their hands behind their backs, securing them immediately in heavy steel handcuffs. The distinct metallic clicking sound echoed sharply across the silent room, cementing the absolute reality of their devastating crimes. They were formally arrested for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, grand larceny, and the blatant forgery of a licensed notary seal. As the officers marched the 2 disgraced men down the center aisle, the crowd of wealthy attendees parted instinctively, shrinking back against the linen-draped tables as if failure was a highly contagious disease. No one offered a single word of support or intervention. The powerful men who had arrogantly believed they were entirely above the law, untouchable in their gilded towers, were shoved unceremoniously into the back of waiting patrol cars, their reputations and freedom destroyed forever. Courtney remained huddled on the carpeted floor of the stage, her meticulously styled hair falling in messy, ruined clumps across her tear-streaked face. She buried her face in the torn fabric of her incredibly expensive designer evening gown, unleashing a series of raw, agonizing sobs that echoed pathetically through the emptying ballroom. Her entire future had just been publicly obliterated in a matter of minutes. I watched carefully as Preston's parents, the wealthy aristocratic couple who had been sitting prominently in the front row, stood up in absolute unison. They did not rush forward to comfort my sister or offer any reassurances. Instead, they exchanged a single horrified glance before turning their backs on the collapsing spectacle entirely. Preston's mother paused only long enough to inform Courtney that the wedding was permanently canceled, effective immediately, before leading her husband briskly out of the hotel lobby. Courtney let out a breathless shriek, pounding her bare fists against the wooden floorboards as her high society dreams evaporated completely into thin air. The next morning brought a cold, unrelenting sunlight that offered absolutely no comfort to the guilty. At exactly 8 o'clock, I pulled my car onto the pristine circular driveway of the primary family estate. I did not come alone. 4 heavily built men from a private elite security firm flanked my sides, their intimidating physical presence ensuring absolute compliance. I unlocked the massive mahogany front doors using the master key I had legally acquired the previous afternoon. The interior of the sprawling mansion was a chaotic, humiliating disaster zone. Susan and Courtney were sprinting frantically between the grand foyer and the sweeping staircase, shoving designer clothing, expensive jewelry, and irreplaceable family heirlooms into a haphazard pile of expensive leather suitcases. Their faces were pale, unwashed, and thoroughly exhausted. Their eyes were wide with the panicked, manic energy of cornered animals finally realizing the steel trap had snapped shut around them. Courtney froze the exact second she heard my footsteps echoing against the polished marble floor. She dropped a handful of wrinkled silk blouses and marched aggressively toward me, her tear-streaked face twisting into an ugly mask of pure, desperate entitlement. "You cannot do this to us, Rebecca," she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the cavernous vaulted room. "We need massive amounts of money right now. Preston is sitting in a federal holding cell, and Dad is being interrogated by the fraud division as we speak. I need you to authorize an immediate emergency release from my personal trust fund account. I have to hire a top-tier criminal defense lawyer this very second. You are the trustee, and you have a strict legal obligation to disburse those funds whenever I demand them. Give me my money immediately. I am not leaving this house until I get what is rightfully mine, and if you try to stop me, I will sue you for absolutely everything. I stared at her, feeling a profound, undeniable sense of clinical satisfaction wash over me. I signaled for the security guards to step forward, effectively blocking Courtney from moving any closer to my position. I do not have a legal obligation to disburse anything to you, Courtney, I replied, my voice steady, incredibly calm, and utterly uncompromising. Furthermore, there is absolutely no money left anywhere for you to demand. The Sterling Family Trust no longer exists in any capacity. Courtney's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her aggressive, entitled posture collapsing instantly under the weight of my words. Susan gasped loudly behind her, dropping a heavy velvet jewelry box onto the hardwood floor with a dull thud. When Grandfather Theodore established the trust, he was acutely aware of his son's insatiable, destructive greed, I explained, ensuring every single syllable hit with devastating precision. To protect his life work from parasites, he embedded a strict, irrevocable morals clause directly into the foundational bylaws of the trust agreement. Any beneficiary found participating in criminal activity or intentionally defrauding the estate triggers an automatic, unappealable fail-safe protocol. By forging my signature to illegally secure a $2 million shadow loan, Richard and Susan explicitly violated that core directive. The active federal fraud investigation initiated the immediate permanent dissolution of the trust. I pulled a thick, legally certified document from my leather briefcase and dropped it onto the marble table in the foyer. Pursuant to Grandfather Theodore's explicit fail-safe instructions, the very moment the trust was officially dissolved, every single liquid asset, commercial property, and investment portfolio was instantly and permanently transferred out of the Sterling name. The vast wealth you have spent your entire lives bragging about now belongs entirely to a blind charitable foundation. The money will be used exclusively to fund educational programs and vital community outreach initiatives in significantly lower-income neighborhoods. You have absolutely zero access to those accounts, and you possess zero legal standing to contest the transfer in any court of law. The money is gone, Courtney. It is gone forever, and it is never coming back to save you. Susan let out a breathless, agonizing wail, sinking heavily onto the bottom step of the grand staircase. She clutched her head tightly, rocking back and forth as the horrifying reality of her absolute ruin finally set in. She had spent decades ruthlessly prioritizing status, immense wealth, and shallow appearances over basic human decency. She had ruthlessly bullied me, manipulated her husband, and actively enabled her youngest daughter's toxic entitlement, all to protect a fortune that she had never actually earned a single penny of. Now, permanently stripped of her platinum credit cards, her elite social standing, and her stolen assets, she was nothing more than a pathetic, terrified woman, facing the terrifying prospect of true, inescapable accountability. She looked up at me, her eyes begging desperately for a mercy she had never once extended to me. I did not offer her a single ounce of sympathy. I turned slightly to the lead security guard standing beside me and gave him a brief, decisive nod. The guard stepped forward silently, reaching into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out two crisp, identical white paper envelopes and extended his large hand, offering one directly to Susan and one to Courtney. "What is this?" Courtney whispered, her hands trembling violently as she took the envelope and tore it open with frantic, uncoordinated movements. Inside each envelope was exactly $200 in cash. It was the precise amount Susan had coldly handed me at the airport when she originally abandoned me. "That is your final disbursement," I stated coldly, my tone completely devoid of emotion. "Since your personal checking accounts are frozen by federal authorities and your credit cards have been permanently deactivated by the banks that cash represents your only remaining liquid assets in the world. You have exactly 5 minutes to finish packing your bags before my security team physically escorts you to the front gate and locks you out. You cannot leave us with nothing," Susan sobbed, clutching the small stack of $20 bills as if it were a physical lifeline. We have nowhere to go. We have absolutely nothing left. My friends will not answer my calls, and Richard's associates have already blacklisted me from their properties. How am I supposed to survive out there? I looked down at the two miserable women who had made my life a living nightmare for as long as I could remember. They systematically stripped away my confidence, mocked my ambitions, and treated my existence as an inconvenient burden that they were forced to endure. I felt absolutely no guilt. You said you were better off without me, I replied, echoing the cruel words she weaponized against me a month prior. I am just giving you the space you asked for. For my entire life, I was conditioned to believe that family was an unbreakable bond, an obligation that demanded endless, silent sacrifice. I was taught that love meant enduring disrespect, and that loyalty meant funding the lavish illusions of people who would gladly let me drown to protect their own vanity. But the hardest, most profoundly liberating lesson I learned from the collapse of the Sterling Empire is this: shared DNA does not entitle anyone to your peace, your sanity, or your hard-earned success. We often wait for those who exploit us to miraculously realize our worth. We hope that if we just endure enough, they will finally see us. But toxic people do not change when they are comfortable. They only panic when they lose control and access to your resources. You cannot heal in the very environment that actively breaks you. True power is not about seeking vindictive revenge. It is about reclaiming your own narrative. It is about having the courage to look at the people who underestimated you, manipulated you, and tried to bleed you dry, and realizing that their ultimate rejection was actually your greatest protection. Walking away from toxic family members is a terrifying leap, but it is the only way to discover who you are without their suffocating expectations. You absolutely do not owe your abusers a seat at the table you built with your own two hands. Setting an uncompromising boundary is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-love and survival. Have you ever had to draw a hard line and walk away from toxic family members to protect your own peace? How did you find the courage to finally choose yourself? Share your experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that their worth is not determined by those who failed to see it. Remember, you hold the pen to your own life story.